There's this idea in the New Testament, if you knock, the door will open. You think, well, that's an unbelievably, naively optimistic statement that no one in their right mind would possibly give any credence to. But the world is a very strange place. And it is the case that your perceptions of the world and the personality that you inhabit orients itself around your fundamental goal. You're goal-directed creatures. You look forward. We point at everything. Like we're arrows that are aimed at, we're either aimed at something or at nothing, but we have to be aimed. And if you aim at something, then the probability that something will come out of that is radically enhanced. And it might not even be what you aim at to begin with, but that's okay, because what do you know? Like, you might be aiming wrong. If you aim and then move forward, your perspective will change, and then maybe you can shift your aim, and that's fine, but at least you're moving forward. And then the future you want to create is the future that you create. And you might as well create it, because you don't have anything better to do. The other thing that's so important to realize, and this is part of the issue with regards to fragility, is you're all in on this game. You've already staked your life on it. And so you, as far as I can tell, you might as well stake your life on something that you regard as worthwhile, because you're staking your life anyways. And what's the alternative? You're going to stake your life on something you don't think is worthwhile? It's like, how is that an improvement? There's no improvement in that. And so if you want to plow a better pathway forward, then get out the plow and start working it. And that works way better than it works way better than you would think. I've often wondered, and I think it's a reasonable thing to wonder, it's like, we're not doing too bad in this world, you know. Things are a lot better than they were 50 years ago, and there's a lot of reason to be optimistic, and there's reason to be pessimistic. But you know, it's not like we're all in making things better. We're maybe 60-40 or 65-35 or something like that, each of us individually and then also collectively. You wonder what would happen if we were all in, just how much better we could make things. And there's something that's worth thinking about. There's something to devote yourself to. It's like, how much suffering could you rectify if that was your goal? Your own and other people's as well. And how much malevolence could you constrain? And what amount of good could you do in the world? That's a noble goal, and it's certainly something worth discovering, unless you have something better to do. And it doesn't seem to me that you do. So, well, especially when you think about good, is not as something that's associated with naive adherence to a set of constraining rules, you know, that all good is obedience. I'm not talking about that at all. I'm saying, look, there's problems that are out there in the world, and some of those problems bother you. They're your problems. Right? I don't know why they bother you and some other problems bother someone else, but there are problems that bother you. Those are your problems. Right? That's your call to adventure. Solve them and see who you are. Put your life together and make something better. That's the way to defeat nostalgia for the false past. And don't be so sure you can't do it. I have this program I'll tell you about very briefly, because of the effects it's had that have been surprising to us, because we've tested this empirically. It's called the Future Authoring Program, and it's on a site called selfauthoring.com. And it's a program that is designed to help people make a plan for their life. And it's a fairly straightforward program in some sense, although not so much in others. I might say, well, what do you want to do with your life? And you think, oh my God, I can't answer that question. It's like, that's a big question. And so you don't know. Part of the problem is it's not a very good question. It's not differentiated enough. So if you ask yourself a question that's so large you can't answer it, well, then you should ask yourself a smaller question. And so in this program, you're asked to do things. We tried to make it practical. It's like, okay, it's 3 to 5 years down the road, and you get to have what you need and want within reason, right? Assuming you're taking care of yourself within reason. Well, what might you want? How would you like your family interactions to be going? Siblings, parents? What about your intimate relationship? If you could have what you wanted and needed from that, just what would that look like, hypothetically? Your career or your job, because those aren't the same thing. At least maybe you could have a job that is respectable and that constitutes a valid contribution to those around you and helps justify your position in society. And perhaps you could even have a career, you know, that has some intrinsic meaning independently of that. Your education, your resistance to the temptation of drugs and alcohol and the sorts of things that knock people off the track, your care for yourself mentally and physically, your use of time productively and in an engaging manner outside of work. You could have what you wanted. What would it be? Answer it. Guess if you have to. And then write for 20 minutes about what your life could be like if all of that manifested itself. And then do the reverse. Write about what your life would be like in 3 to 5 years if you let everything about you that isn't good have full sway and take you to your own little subdivision of hell. And people are pretty aware of that. Everyone knows. Everyone I've ever talked to has some real sense of how they would degenerate if they degenerated in their own particular way. Some people would become cruel. Some people would become homicidal. Some people would become alcoholic. Some people would end up on the street. Some people would drift into prostitution. People know where their weaknesses are likely to tempt them and take them. And so then you sketch out a little hell and a little heaven, and maybe you're motivated to run from the one, which is good, and to run toward the other. And so then you have a framework for your life. And then maybe you make a strategic plan. Well, we've done that now with thousands of people in Holland and in Canada, mostly university students, well, all university students in the research studies. And we found at this little college in Canada, Mohawk College, that if you brought students in the summer in their orientation and just had them do this program, which should probably take you about 5 days if you did it thoroughly, if you had them do it really badly in an hour, that decreased the probability that the men would drop out in the first semester by 50%. It was a staggering finding, and we found findings of similar magnitude across the other studies. And the reason I'm telling you this is because a lot of the reason that people don't get what they want is because they don't aim at it. This idea that you should have higher self-esteem or that you should be happy, it's like, Jesus, it's so weak. It's so pathetic. It's like, first of all, forget it, because you're not who you should be and you don't deserve your self-esteem. And second, what good is happiness going to do you when you're unhappy? And you will be. So there's nothing in that to get you out of bed in the morning. You need an adventure, and the greater the better. And so it's back to the high seas, gentlemen. You know, out on the rolling waves where there are new continents to conquer and new things to overcome. And if you think that all the frontiers are gone, then you're not looking, because there's frontiers everywhere, and that's where you should be, right? Working diligently to expand the domain of habitable order into the chaos of potential. And that'll force you to discover who you are and to bring that into the world. And that's the role of men in the 21st century. And there's nothing about that that's anything but good for anyone. I mean, one of the things that I detest about the current collectivist ideology and the insistence that what we live in is a patriarchal tyranny is that it associates the activity of stalwart men with nothing but tyranny and power. And I think that that's dreadful beyond imagining, because it conflates bravery and courage and competence and the desire to adopt responsibility and the ability to be generous with nothing but power. And it gives men, especially young men, an excuse to be useless so that they'll be harmless, so that they won't be destructive. And none of that's helpful. It's like you're a dangerous creature, and that's a good thing. And you should harness that and discipline it towards some impossible goal, one you can barely lift, and see if you can manage to struggle uphill with it. And then things will straighten themselves out. And then we won't have to ask, well, what's the role of men in the 21st century? There are terrible problems that need to be solved. Solve them. It's within our power to solve them. It's within your power to solve the problems that present themselves to you as your problems. Solve them. That's the right solution. And there's nothing in that isn't good. And there's nothing in it that isn't like that call to adventure that can get you up in the morning when it's a difficult morning, you know, when things have collapsed around you for one reason or another. You need a purpose for moving forward, and it has to be the sort of purpose that justifies the suffering. So that's that. That's part of what tradition is supposed to teach you by presenting you with examples of great people of the past. The lesson is not supposed to be exactly bow down and worship these people. It's be like them. Be like them. And you could be. And I mean, that's really the goal of the humanities. When it's the humanities, if it's not, if that's the goal, then students will study the humanities. As soon as that ceases to be the goal, then there's nothing of value there. I mean, great literature tells you the great story of good and evil, always. It's good and evil against a background of chaos and order, always. And the evil characters are there to be bad examples, and the good characters are there to be good examples, or you see the interplay of those forces within a single person. And it's a reminder of who you could be. And you can find out who you should be. It's actually this is something quite mysterious, I believe, and part of the proof, let's say, that we exist in a world of value. Your conscience tells you who you should be. Now, that doesn't mean that necessarily that it's infallible, but people wrestle with their conscience. You know, there isn't anyone, I've never met anyone who is, you know, narcissists accepted, let's say. Yeah. People are generally tormented by their conscience. And the reason for that is that they're deviating from the path that is their destiny. I mean, and if you don't think that, well, then what do you think? What do you think that conscience is? I mean, I've asked my classes repeatedly, do you have a little voice in your head that tells you when you've done something wrong, or you're about to, or a feeling? And they all immediately agree with that. No one finds that a foreign concept. And so if you don't know who you are, your conscience will remind you when you're not, or sorry, if you don't know who you could be, your conscience will remind you when you deviate. And then you can start to attend to that. Think, well, look, I'm actually ashamed when I do this. I should stop. Unless I want to be ashamed all the time, it looks like I should stop. And then maybe you stop doing that, and then your conscience objects to something else, and maybe you stop doing that. And as that happens, you start to develop a vision of who you could be. And the chapter indicates it looks at symbolic representations. It's an examination of a certain symbolic representation of the ideal. And so it's my attempt to assess tradition for what it can tell us about what the ideal human being might be like. And the ideal human being is the person who forthrightly upholds the traditions of the culture and forges a way into the unknown. We went through that, and pulls new information in and rebuilds himself and the world. For you to make contact with the highest of values, you have to bring that down to your particulars and figure out how you do that. It's going to be a way that no one else does it, because you're the only one that's you. But you can aim at something. And the point of the chapter is that you aim at something, and that will shape you as you move towards it. And then your aim will change. You'll move, but that doesn't matter. It gets you going, and you'll be molded across time more and more into the person you could be.
When you're doing it right, what does it feel like?
Well, to begin with, and this happened when I was in graduate school, I had a lot of bad habits. I smoked like a pack of cigarettes a day, and I drank a lot. I came from this little town in northern Alberta, and like many little towns, especially in northern Canada, the alcohol overuse is de rigueur, you know, and so I noticed when I was in my early 20s that the only time I really regretted what I had done was when I was drinking. Now, it was also interfering with me writing, because I couldn't concentrate well enough if I was hungover, but I also couldn't really I couldn't tolerate the emotional strain of what I was writing about when I was hungover. It was I couldn't handle being on the edge because I destabilized my nervous system. In any case, I stopped drinking. And the reason for that was, well, I decided I didn't want to be ashamed of what I was doing anymore. I thought, well, maybe I could not do things that were shameful and then see what my life was like. So that was sort of on the negative end, the constraint end. I think people get, on the more positive end, people get deeply involved in what they're doing if they're in the right place in the right time. So that I would say you can tell, this is the idea of heaven on earth to some degree. When time stops, when you're not aware of the duration of time, when you're so engaged with what you're doing that you're not aware of the duration of time, then you've got the forces of chaos and order balanced properly. You're not stultified and bored. That's an excess of order. Everything's too predictable. You're not overwhelmed. You're dealing with, you're playing tennis at the peak of your game. That's partly what people experience when they're great athletes, when they play.
The zone, yeah.
And they're always stretching themselves to their limit. You can tell that if you watch a gymnast, for example, who has a brilliant performance. They've stretched themselves beyond their domain of competence during the performance. And that's what makes everybody leap to their feet. That's the incarnation given embodiment right there in front of you for some moments. And everyone cheers that on.
That it becomes fleeting in that suddenly you could have a great month and then suddenly something happens, chaos returns. Like it's that we almost forget that moment. You can't hold it.
Well, it requires even to some degree some good fortune to maintain. I certainly haven't been able to do that while I was ill. And time, one of the consequences of my illness, whatever it was or is, was time dilation. Like days lasted weeks, it seemed like minutes lasted hours. And I mean that literally. And that was terrible. The weight of time, it's the weight of brute mortality. It's the weight of self-consciousness. And you escape that immersed properly. So, and that second chapter is a pretty practical chapter. It's like, well, if you're not who you want to be, then think about how you could be better. Take a chance, aim at that, work at it, and see what happens. One of the things I tell young people all the time, I'm not a very typical psychologist in this regard, because psychologists like to pat people on the head and say, you're all right the way you are. I talked to Bishop Barron a while ago, I'm going to broadcast this, and he said that the Catholic priests were trained in the 1960s to kind of be accepting, humanistically. You're okay the way you are, And that's such rubbish. It's like, not only are you not okay the way you are, you don't think that anybody else is okay the way they are either. And you don't think your children are okay the way they are, like you love them and all that, but you don't want them to stay 3 years old their entire life. You want them to expand and improve and become who they are. And so, instead of telling young people that they're okay the way they are, I tell them that, and it's a terrible message for them if they're desperate. So let's say 10% of the people in my audience are young, maybe they're young men, just for the sake of argument, and they're like not in good shape. They don't have any goals. They're drinking too much. They're watching pornography all the time. They've got no aim. They've got no structure in their life, and they're just bloody miserable. And the misery is twisting them into malevolence, because enough misery will absolutely do that to you. And then what are you going to do? And come along and say, well, you're okay the way you are? It's like, that's the last thing they want to hear. It's like, get your damn act together. You got things to do, and they're going to be difficult. And that there's an echoing Christian message in there, I would say, which is you pick up the weight of your suffering voluntarily, and you walk uphill with it. And that not only gives you the meaning that you need in your life to stop you from degenerating in a dangerous manner, but it actually makes things better. And so that all has to be part of it. Like, I believe in human ingenuity. I think we can solve all the problems that beset us. But it can't just be it has to be more than we can enhance material well-being, which is what it tends to be now. It's not enough. And so, and you get brushed off by the apocalyptic types. You know, I've been an advocate for people to put their lives together. And of course, my life has fallen apart. And so you might ask yourself, well, are you aware of the irony of that? And the answer to that is, well, absolutely. You know, it's shameful. I feel that frequently. And then so you might say, and people tweet this out fairly regularly, you know, who am I to give advice? And I suppose that's a perfectly relevant question. I guess I've always thought, and I said this too in the lectures during the tour, that I don't really think that what I'm doing is giving advice, or if I am, I'm also giving it to me. You know, it's not like I believe that I have all the answers. I have answers that I've found useful while attempting to move ahead. And with this new book, I can show you this. That's what it looks like. The black counterpart to the white book, the previous book.
Out today.
You know, I wrote a lot of it while I was extremely ill. And there were some advantages to that, I think, in that I only kept that material that I felt was reliable under duress. Now, I think perhaps my creativity was somewhat compromised, and so that may have impacted the book negatively, but it made for more severe editing. For example, the last chapter is be grateful in spite of your suffering. And certainly maintaining that gratitude is something I've struggled with. I think anybody who's in pain chronically struggles with resentment, but I know that resentment poisons. And I think that form of courage. And so I stand by what I've written. People are often resentful if they see that responsibility has been abdicated. Why isn't that person doing their job? It's like, well, hey man, step in at your workplace, in your family. You know, and you think, well, I shouldn't have to do that extra work. Well, you shouldn't be a slave. You shouldn't allow yourself to be tyrannized. But if something bugs you because a responsibility is going unfulfilled, there's a great opportunity for you. And this is something I don't think we teach young people well. And one of the things, you may remember this, that was so striking about the tour was that I made a case fairly consistently that most people find the meaning that sustains them through the vicissitudes of life, not in happiness, but in responsibility. And that would bring everyone to a halt. It would always make the whole theater silent. It's like, oh, I never thought of that connection. Because maybe you want to avoid responsibility, and you can understand why. You can understand why. You hide from it. Like Abraham, one of the biblical stories, Abraham, he stays in his father's tent till he's like 80, and then God gets fed up and tells him to get the hell out and grow up, and everything that he encounters is catastrophic. He encounters tyranny. The Egyptians conspire to steal his wife. He encounters starvation and war. That is what you encounter if you go out in the world and you think, who the hell wants that? I don't want the responsibility. It's like, well, yes, you do, as it turns out. There's nothing better than responsibility. Now, you know, I say that with some caution. I think that it's hard to say. The responsibility, I've been overwhelmed by my apparent responsibility. But I think it's also kept me alive. And I mean that literally. And so...
Wait, can you go a little deeper with that? I mean, when you were at your darkest moments in the last 2 years, whatever that might be, was it the feeling of the...
many times in the last year where it would have been much easier for me just to be dead. That's constant. So, but no.
But is it but no because of something in you, or is it but no because of the people, that you would have abdicated that responsibility to the people? Or is that ultimately the same thing?
It.
Yeah.
Well, I do think that the two aren't easily distinguishable, but it's definitely that. It's definitely that. you know, and it's one of the chapters, the last chapter, is be grateful in spite of your suffering. You know, you need a meaning to sustain you through suffering, and it is the case that you find that in responsibility. Well, and so it's good advice for anyone who's at work. You're resentful about this and that because people aren't pulling their weight. Pull it. See what happens. You'll become indispensable instantly. You'll know everything. And maybe that job won't be for you, or maybe that relationship won't be for you, but you'll take your hard acquired wisdom, go elsewhere and flourish there. So, you know, this kid stopped me. I think I wrote about this in this book. Kid stopped me in a restaurant one day when I was walking in, and he said, and he had an undergraduate degree, and he was working as a waiter in a chain steak place. And he stopped me and he said, you know, about 6 months ago, I was watching one of your lectures and I decided to stop being resentful about my job. And he was resentful because he had a university degree and he's working as a waiter. You know, and look, I don't have anything against waiters. It's like a waiter can make your evening, you know, hooray. He said, well, I decided I'd start trying at my job, like really trying as if it was worthwhile. He said he got 3 promotions in 6 months, like he's just rocketing up the power hierarchy. Well, it's not power, it's competence if it's well run. You know, and places are full of opportunity. If you concentrate solely on your career, you can get a long way in your career. And I would say that that's a strategy that a minority of men preferentially do. That's all they do. They work like 70, 80 hours a week. They go flat out on their career. They're staking everything on the small probability of exceptional status in a narrow domain. But it's hard on them. They don't have a life. It's very difficult for them to have a family. They don't know how to take any leisure activity. Like, they get very one-dimensional. Now, it may be that unidimensionality is the price you have to pay to be exceptional at one thing, right? Because if you're going to be something like a genius level mathematician and you want to do that or a scientist, say, it's like you're in your lab all the time, you're working 70 hours a week or 80 hours a week, you're smart, you're dedicated, you're unidimensional, and that's how you get to beat all the other people who are doing that. It's the only way. But the problem is you don't get a life. Now, if you love being a scientist and you have that kind of focus of mind, well, first of all, you're a rare person, and second, you're going to pay for it. But fine, more power to you. But it's a risky business to do that. You sacrifice a lot for it. You know, and I would say most often, if you're speaking about having a healthy life, that isn't what you do. You spread yourself out more. So, you know, you have a family, you have some things that you do outside of work that are meaningful to you and useful. You have a network of friends. Well, those 3 things alone, or 4 things alone, are plenty to keep you well oriented. And then if one of those things collapses, you know, everything doesn't go. Now, the price you pay for that is the more you strive to optimize that balance, the less likely you are to be fantastically successful at any single one of them. But you might have a very, you know, if you consider your life as a whole, that might be a winning strategy. One of the things Carl Jung said, I really liked this. He thought that men went after perfection and women went after wholeness. So they're different value, they're different, there's something different at the top of the value hierarchy. So perfection would be stake it all on one thing and look for radical success. Not that all men do that, because they don't, but we're talking about extremes, at least with regards to the men that do that. The wholeness idea is more like, well, it's like I want one thing in my life to be 150%, or I want 5 things in my life to be 80%. Well, there's a lot more richness in a life where you have 5 things operating at 80%, but you're not operating at any of them at 150%. So, and I really believe this because I've watched men and women go through their careers now for a long period of time, and one of the things there's lots of things that produce this, but one of the things that I've noticed is that mostly women in their 30s bail out of unidimensional careers. They won't do them. They won't put in the 80 hours a week that they would have to put in order to dominate that particular area. And it isn't, the reason that they won't do it is because they decide it's not worth it. And no wonder, because why would that be worth it? You have to ask yourself that. It's like, well, you want to be an outstanding scientist. It's like, okay, really, that's what you want? Because that means that's what you do. Because you're competing with other people, you know, they're smart, they're hardworking, and if you want to be at the top, you have to be smarter and work harder than any of them. And working hard means working long hours. I mean, it also means working diligently, but in the final analysis, it's also an additive issue. If I'm smart and hardworking and I can crank out for 70 hours a week, and you do it for 30, it's like, in 2 years, I'm so far ahead of you, you will never ever catch up.
We were sitting in the first row of the plane, and do you remember the guy was a young black man, sort of ran onto the plane. He was wearing a yellow vest. He was a worker working the bridge or something. And he came up to you and he said, I'm not supposed to be on the plane right now. I'm not supposed to say anything, but you helped me turn my life around. I got this job because of you. And what I remember more than anything else is he had this huge smile on his face. But it wasn't because you told him to go out there and be happy. It was because you told him to go out there and fix some stuff. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about right now.
Those experiences are so life-sustaining. It's so remarkable to have that happen, and that's something I've been immensely privileged to constantly experience, although there's also something about it that's extremely painful. You know, the magnitude of that joy is sort of proportional to the obstacles it had to overcome while it was attempting to manifest itself. You know, and one of the things I'm sure you saw on the tour, and I don't know how this affected you, was the depth of hunger for encouragement that exists everywhere, as far as I can tell. And everyone wants to be appreciated when they bring their best to the table. That's why the current assault on merit is so unbelievably brutal, because it will deny everyone the right to be appreciated for being their best. And well, you might ask, well, when does the best become your enemy? And that's easy. It's when you flee from it. If you don't know who you should be, pick something. Pick something. Pick something that would be an accomplishment. Even do it somewhat arbitrarily, because you know, maybe you have too many choices, you don't know what you're interested in. Start somewhere, aim at something, do it. Maybe it's a 6-month certificate at something. Maybe it's an online course. Whatever. Pick something. Work hard at it. See what happens. What'll happen is, well, you'll get more disciplined as a consequence of the work, and so that'll make you a somewhat different person. But also, as you work on it, you'll figure out in more detail why it's for you or why it's not. And then when you make the next decision, you'll be more informed. That's how a self-correcting cybernetic system works, essentially. You establish an aim and you move towards it. As you move towards it, you gather information. That may shift your aim, but you have to move towards the aim.
So in essence, even if you don't accomplish what you set out to do, that the lessons along the way, that is the higher lesson at some level.
Yes, well, and you, let's say you should try to accomplish it, but I say, let's say, well, you get halfway through it and you think, I really know this isn't for me. Then you might say, well, how do you know you're not just copping out?
Yeah.
And I would say, well, you can set up a check against that by swearing when you start something that you won't switch it except for something more difficult. And then, because, you know, everybody has that tendency to rationalize their procrastination, and that's a good way of protecting yourself against that. It's like, I can quit this, but I have to have a better plan that's more difficult, and I can jump into that. And this is also associated with something like the necessary minimum of respect for tradition. If you pick a goal, it'll be a goal that's a social institution of some sort, virtually, with virtual certainty, because it has to be valuable to other people to be valuable, generally speaking. You don't want to be so cynical that you stop yourself from pursuing anything because nothing's worthwhile. That's not helpful. And everyone knows that. And you might say, well, I can't get out of that cynicism. And I would say, well, jumping out of the cynicism may be very difficult. Try just doing something local. Just pick something. You know, if you don't have a relationship, make a dating profile. You don't even have to put it online. But at least you have the profile. You're taking a step in that direction.
You don't know what's possible. And you're not as much as you could be. And so God only knows what you could do and have and give if you sacrificed everything to it. And that's the reason Abraham is constantly making sacrifices. And it's archaic, right? He's burning up like baby lambs, but like, well, they're alive, you know, that's something. And they're valuable, and that's something. You have to admit, even if you think about it as a modern person, that the act of sacrificing something might have some dramatic compulsion to it, you know, to go out into a flock and to take something that's newborn and to cut its throat and to bleed it and to burn it might be a way of indicating to yourself that you're actually serious about something. And it isn't so obvious that we have rituals of seriousness like that now. And so it's not so obvious that we're actually serious about anything. And so maybe that's not such a good thing. And so maybe we shouldn't be thinking that these people were so archaic and primitive and superstitious. It's possible that they knew something that we don't. And certainly in the Abrahamic stories, one of the things that maintains Abraham's covenant with God is his continual willingness to sacrifice. And it's so that sacrificial issue is so important because you are not committed to something unless you're willing to sacrifice for it. Commitment and sacrifice are the same thing. And I think it borders on miraculous that those concepts are embedded into this narrative at the level of dramatic action, you know, instead of abstract explanation. People are acting this out. And the fundamental conception is so profound that it's really quite awe-inspiring. It's breathtaking, really, when you understand what message is trying to be conveyed. You have to make sacrifices. And what do you have to sacrifice? You have to sacrifice that which is most valuable to you currently that's stopping you. And God only knows what that is. It's certainly the worst of you. It's certainly that. And God only knows to what degree you're in love with the worst of you. So you move from the unbearable present to the ideal future. And you can't help that. You have to live in a structure like that. That's your house. That's another way of thinking about it. And if you want to get your house in order, and if you want it to be a place that you can live properly, then you have to plan the future that is perfect. And then I think, well, what does that mean? And it means it's good for you, right? And one of the things that I do all the time with my clinical and consulting clients is try to figure out what would be good for them. But we do more than that. We try to think, okay, well, how can we set this up so it's really good for you, and that all the side consequences of that are things that are good for other people. And so, because people are often also timid about trying to get something that's good for themselves because they feel that it's selfish or that they don't deserve it. So we set it up so that, well, look, we're going to set it up so that it's plainly obvious that this will not harm the structure of the universe. For you to have what you need and to do it in a way that's of benefit to other people. There's no downside to that. And so it's okay. It's okay if you reach out and take that. And one of the things that's interesting about the biblical stories, the Abrahamic stories as well, is that God doesn't really seem to be opposed to the success of the people that he's chosen. You know, what happens to them is as they progress through their journey is they get larger flocks, and they get more authority, and they get life more abundant. That's what happens. God doesn't seem to be a miser in the Old Testament. It's like if you put in the effort and you accept the covenant and you make the sacrifices, then you get to be successful, and maybe successful beyond your wildest dreams. And that's actually seems to be okay with God. And that's pretty cool, given that, you know, that general notion of Old Testament God is that all he's doing is casting out curses and death, you know, wherever he happens to wander. And I mean, there's certainly no shortage of that, but again, it seems to me that that's very good news, and that you also don't have to be perfect in order to have that happen. And then the other thing, this is the issue about going into the unknown. It's like, well, if you leave your country and your kin and your father's house and you go out into a land that your intuition guides you to, you're going to undergo these radical transformations. This is a sacrificial transformation too, because you're moving forthrightly and voluntarily into chaos, right? And that's the same as the dragon fight. That's the hero's story. And what will happen there is that you will transform yourself. And so the call to an ideal is also the call to a sequence of deaths and rebirths that move you closer and closer to the ideal.
If you're resentful about something, well, first of all, you should notice, I'm resentful. And that's kind of humiliating because no one's proud of being resentful. It's a shameful emotion. Also, then why are you resentful? Well, there's only two reasons as far as I've been able to tell. One is that you're allowing yourself to be taken advantage of, or you're being taken advantage of. Sometimes you're not allowing yourself. Sometimes you're a child being abused by their uncle. You're not allowing yourself. You can't do anything about it. You're resentful because you're being taken advantage of, or because you're immature. It's one of those two things. Figure out which it is, and then take the steps necessary to address it. Living a life without resentment is a great goal.
I'm doing one thing really stupidly that I should stop doing. It's like, how long is it going to take you to figure out what that is? It's about 2 seconds, right? You've known it forever. And you could even make it less demanding. You could say, there are some stupid things that I'm doing that I know are stupid and wrong, that I could stop doing, that I would stop doing. And then you can just start with that. And you can just do that, and maybe it's just a little thing, although it's not, because it's a step forward on the proper voyage. It's not a small thing. And you think, well, what would happen? You could say, let's do this for a year or even a month. Just try not to do things you know to be stupid and wrong for a month. And that means not to say things you know to be stupid and wrong as well. Maybe that's the most important thing. Just do it as an experiment. See what happens. And it's so fun because I have people writing to me from all over the world who are saying they're doing that. They're saying, well, you know, I cleaned up my room and then I stopped saying stupid things, and my God, it's like things are way better. It's like, who would have guessed it? You know? And so it's low-hanging fruit, man. Because that's the other thing. If there's a lot of things wrong with you, then it's really easy to start fixing it, you know? There's so much territory that you can inhabit. I've had people come to me who have had very chaotic and ill-spent lives, let's say, who were in that neighborhood of age, and it's true for people who are older as well, who then decided to make a real effort and to try to make where they were better, you know, instead of being bitter about where they weren't, because that's the bitterness that really does you in. It's really not good. It's the opposite of gratitude. It's the manifestation of resentment. It makes you malevolent. It's very, very bad to be bitter. It's hell to be bitter. And if you're 40 and you're not successful, then you have to accept your lot and you have to start to improve what's right in front of you. And if you do that, it doesn't take very long. It's quite interesting to watch people. Things can be a lot better in 6 months and they can be way better in 2 years. Like, it's a struggle, uphill struggle, but it's by no means impossible. And I don't know, again, what the limit of that is. I suppose it depends to some degree on the degree of your commitment. But anyway, so it's another indication of the real validity of this story. God isn't setting this up to be easy, right? Abraham's old, and his wife is old too, and more than that, she's barren. How is he going to be the father of nations? How is he going to be successful? Well, the initial departure point is insufficient, radically insufficient. And that's very inspiring, because it means that you can start from where you are.
People ask me what it's like to be on tour with you.
Yeah.
I always say, well, he takes life seriously, and it's making me take life more seriously, and I think it's making these people take life more seriously. Do you remember the moment that happened?
Yes.
Can you tell me that moment?
Yes, I can. Yeah. So it was in, I think, 1983. And this is a strange story. I came home from a party university party. And I wasn't in the best mood. I've always had a certain proclivity towards depression, which I've recently discovered is probably an autoimmune problem. In any case, I'd gone to this party and I'd had a lot to drink because I like to drink. And I don't know, I wasn't happy with something that happened at the party. I wasn't happy with the way I behaved. I mean, that's not uncommon, right? If you like to drink, then you're not happy with the way you behave. Those things just go together. And so, but it was deeper than that. It wasn't just that I was unhappy with the way the party had gone, but I was deeply dissatisfied with how I was oriented in life. Like I felt that there was it was a nihilism, I suppose, that was gnawing at me. This was not long after I'd worked for a socialist party in Canada for a while when I was a kid. And this wasn't long after I stopped doing that. And so I kind of lost my moorings. And, the Christianity that my mother practiced in particular, I'd abandoned that when I was like 13. And so I didn't have any structure to orient me at all. And so I was experimenting a little bit with artistic production at this point. Not a lot, but a bit. And so I took out this canvas from my closet and I sat down and I sketched out this picture, and I just let my imagination roam. And what came out was it was a crucifixion, and there was I drew a picture of Christ on the crucifixion, but with a very judgmental face, very angry face, and with a snake wrapped around his waist. And it was a really harsh picture. It was like an expressionist picture. Not that I have the talent of an expressionist, but that's what it was. And I thought, I mean, I wasn't thinking, I didn't think that I was thinking in religious terms at that point at all. And I was an absolutely sporadic churchgoer, and I was absolutely shocked by this picture. I thought, where the hell did this come from? What did that possibly mean? It took me years to figure out what it meant. I mean, really, one thing, so I'll tell you part of what it meant. So Carl Jung said something very interesting about the structure of the New Testament. He said that the gospel Christ is fundamentally, although not entirely, fundamentally a figure of compassion. But the ideal is not only compassion. The ideal is also a judge, because an ideal is a judge. Let's say you have an ideal. Well, it's a judge because you don't live up to it. And so your ideal is always looking at you like you're not what you should be. And the higher the ideal, the more judgmental the judge. Well, that's why he thought the book of Revelation, first of all, emerged as an unconscious revelation, which because Christ comes back at the end of time, so the story goes, as the ultimate judge. And virtually no one is judged acceptable. Well, why? Well, because by the highest possible, speaking psychologically, even biologically for that matter, the idea of Christ is the instantiation of the ideal as such. That's what it is. Now, it might be more than that, but that's what it is. It's whatever a human being would be if a human being was perfect. And it's an effort of our collective imagination to represent that symbolically, which we do with cathedrals, for example, when we paint the image of Christ against the dome that represents eternity itself. That's the ideal. Now you might say, well, I don't believe in the ideal. It's like, you're missing the point. So that ideal is a judge, and the farther you are away from that ideal, the harsher the judge. And so the snake was part of that, because the thing is that if you're low enough and the ideal is high enough, the ideal itself is so judgmental and so detached for you that it starts to look to you like your enemy. And so that was the painting. And it was like, and I was asking a question, that was the thing, I was asking a question. I was asking, like, what would I have to do to set this, what would I have to do to set the situation that I'm in right? And so then I drew this picture, and the picture had the answer. I mean, artistic production always has the answer. That's where the answers come from, and so that was a manifestation of imagination. It was part of me attempting in its symbolic mode of personified thinking to deliver a message. And so I swore that night that I was going to do whatever it took to set myself right, period, whatever. And I was dead serious about that. And so that was the moment. And then I don't know what I did with that picture. I hid it in my closet because I was so freaked out by it. I thought, what the hell is this? It's like some schizophrenic nightmare. It's like underneath the covers with that thing. But it wasn't long after that I wrote the first essay that eventually turned into this Maps of Meaning book. It was a poem to begin with, actually. That was how it came about first. So that's when I decided to straighten myself out.
Okay, so imagine that something glimmers before you. It's an interest that's dawning, and you decide, well, first of all, you're paralyzed. You think, well, how do I know if I should pursue that? It's probably a stupid idea. And the proper response to that is, you're right, it probably is a stupid idea, because almost all ideas are stupid. And so the probability that as you move forward on your adventure that you're going to get it right the first time is zero. It's just not going to happen. And so then you might think, well, maybe I'll just wait around until I get the right idea, and which people do, right? So they're like 40-year-old, 13-year-olds, which is not a good idea. And so they wait around until it's waiting for Godot, until they finally got it right. But the problem is you're too stupid to know when you've got it right. So waiting around isn't going to help, because even if the perfect opportunity manifested itself to you in your incomplete form, the probability that you would recognize it as the perfect opportunity is zero. You might even think it's the worst possible idea that you've ever heard of anywhere. Highly likely, highly likely. So you have, Nietzsche called that a will to stupidity, which I really liked. So, because he thought of stupidity as being it, you have to take it into account fundamentally and work with it. And so you can take these tentative steps on your pathway to destiny, and you can assume that you're going to do it badly. And that's really useful, because you don't have to beat yourself up. It's pretty easy to do it badly. But the thing is, it's way better to do it badly than not to do it at all. And that's the continual message that echoes through these historical stories in Genesis. It's like, these are flawed people. They should have got the hell out of their house way before they did. And they go out and they stumble around in tyranny and famine and self-betrayal and violence, but it's a hell of a lot better than just rotting away at home. And that's great, so that's good. And so why is that? Well, okay, so you start your path and you think that you're heading, towards your star. And so you go in that direction. And then, because you're here, the world looks a particular way, but then when you move here, the world looks different, and you're different as a consequence of having made that voyage. And so what that means is that now that thing that glimmers in front of you is going to have shifted its location, because you weren't very good at specifying it to begin with, and now that you're a little sharper and more focused than you were, it's going to reveal itself with more accuracy to you. And so then you have to take it's almost like a 180-degree reversal. But it isn't, because, you've gone this far, and that's a long ways to get that far. But that's a lot farther than you would be if you just stayed where you were, waiting. And so it doesn't matter that you overshoot continually, because as you overshoot, even if you don't learn what you should have done, you're going to continually learn what you shouldn't keep doing. And if you learn enough about what you shouldn't keep doing, then that's tantamount at some point to learning at the same time what you should be doing. So it's okay. So it's like this. Now, what's cool about it, though, I think, is that as you progress, the degree of overshooting starts to decline, right? And that we know that. There's nothing hypothetical about that. As you learn a new skill, like even to play a song on the piano, for example, you overshoot madly. You're making all sorts of mistakes to begin with, and then the mistakes, they disappear.
This guy came up to me last night, He was a kind of a pierced guy, rough-looking guy, and he's probably in his late 20s, maybe early 30s. He said, I've been smoking drug-free for 9 months. And I said, hey, good work, man, because he looked pretty pleased about that. I said, well, you know, hopefully that's a lot better. And he said, it's a lot better. And I said, well, good for you for sticking it out, and I hope you can continue it. And I meant that, because I did mean good for you, and I hope you can stick it out. And he knew I meant that, because he wouldn't have bloody well told me that to begin with if he didn't think that that was going to be the response. And then he said, I got 9 of my mates to do the same thing. Yeah, I thought, right on, man, that's great. And then, you know, I was in Birmingham 2 nights ago, and I walked out of the hotel, and this kid, working class kid, came up to me, you know, just out of the blue, and he said, thank you very much for elevating my vision. I thought, hey, look, it's really a good thing to be able to go around the world and to have people stop you on the street and say things like that to you. It's like, that's as good as it gets, you know? And people are telling me stories like that all the time. They come up and they say, well, you've watched this. It happens all the time. People come up and they tell me some way that their house was out of order, you know, they're hopeless and nihilistic and drinking too much and watching too much pornography and procrastinating too much and being not serious with their relationship and not getting along with their parents and, you know, not formulating a vision and not growing up. And, well, you know, there's just endless ways that you can descend into a kind of, what would you call it, a kind of grungy, filthy carpet infested hell. And then they say, look, I've been watching your lectures, and I developed a plan for my life, and I've been trying to be more responsible, and I've been really trying to tell the truth, and I mended my relationship with my father, and I got married to my girlfriend, and now I have a flat, and I quit doing drugs, and I've just tripled my salary in the last year, and I didn't commit suicide like I was going to 6 months ago. I think I have, I don't know, out of the 150 people that I talk to each night, I would say probably over the course of the lecture series, there's probably 10 people like that a night who tell me that. And so, see, and because I believe what I said tonight, I believe that the individual is sovereign, and that individual sovereignty is the cornerstone of reality itself, and it's the cornerstone of the state, and it's the cornerstone of reality itself. I truly believe that to be the case. That every time I hear someone say, look, I've got my act together, I think that's one more weight on, you know, if the scales are always tilting towards good or towards evil, then every time someone decides to straighten themselves up, they take a major weight off the evil side and they put it on the good side, and it's not trivial. And I believe that that's what the redemption of the world depends on. It's not political. It happens at the level of the individual. Just like the descent into totalitarian catastrophe occurs when people abandon their sovereign responsibility, which I think is the most accurate way of diagnosing what happened in the 20th century. So whenever someone comes up to me and says, I was not doing so well, and here's, you know, 3 ways where I've really put my life together, we have a little 15-second party, and we both know why. And so that's as good as it gets. And so that's happening constantly. And I feel, generally speaking, that these events are like they're celebrations of that. And so interesting to watch the media miss this completely. It's like they don't have the conceptual, what would you say? They don't have the conceptual tools to understand that something might be happening that's worthy of note outside the purely conventional confines of you know, the stultifying and dull political discourse. I'm a psychologist. I decided a long time ago that the individual was the right level of analysis, and so it's an absolute, it's not a pleasure, it's not the right way of thinking about it. What's rule 7? Do what is meaningful, not what is expedient. This is the most deeply meaningful thing that I can envision doing. So that's great. It's great. It's hard. Great is hard. When something great happens, that's hard, right? It's not something trivial, but it doesn't matter because it's great. And so every time someone says to me, I'm better, I'm getting along with my father, I've married my girlfriend, we're going to have a child, we weren't going to have children, now we're going to have children, I think, that's one more. So that's great, man.
That,
How did I balance marriage, fatherhood, and a demanding career? Well, I stopped wasting time. That helped a lot. I stopped drinking. I stopped going to bars. I really didn't spend a lot of time with my friends when I had young kids in particular. I had friends and I saw them, with some degree of regularity, but where I cut corners was more with social life outside my family. So I spent a lot of time with my wife, and I spent a lot of time with my kids, and I spent a lot of time on my career. And so you have to make choices. And I think those were reasonable choices. I'm not displeased with them. Don't abandon your friendships, but you can certainly look at where you're wasting time and just stop doing things that you know to be a waste of time. So, and I did. And so I had enough room for my marriage, and I had enough room for my kids, and I had enough room for my career. And sort of a multi-dimensional career. And it was always a challenge to me too, to see how efficient I could get. And you could also, and I've really recommended this for relatively higher income, dual income couples who are trying to pursue dual careers, kids, and marriage. You can outsource, hire a cleaning lady if you can afford it. Buy restaurant food if you can afford it, etc. You can outsource, you can have someone do your laundry. Then you can concentrate on your marriage and your kids. I know that is only an avenue available to people who have relatively high incomes, but people who have dual incomes have relatively high incomes. And so outsource what's unnecessary so that you can concentrate on what's necessary. I mean, I didn't do that when I was beginning my career, because when I lived in the United States, when I was in my late 20s and starting my family, we had one income. You'd think a Harvard beginning professor makes a lot of money, and I suppose that's true in some absolute sense, but relatively speaking, we didn't have enough money to buy magazines. We all our money went for housing cost and the basic necessities of living. I had a car that was 20 years old, 25 years old, I think. It was old. It was a bloody thing. The doors fell apart on the person I sold it to, like 6 months down the road. They knew it was a wreck at that point, but we drove that thing right into the ground. So I know that's not necessarily possible for everyone at the beginning of their career, but if you have two incomes, you can manage it. I concentrated on my marriage and making time for it. I concentrated on spending time with my kids consciously, and I concentrated on developing my career. Those were the three elements of my life, and I had some time left over for creative pursuits and for friends, but most of it was a matter of getting rid of time wastes of any sort, and I just pushed that out of my life, day after day until I wasn't wasting any time. You have to set up your vision, like Geppetto when he's looking at the star before Pinocchio's transformation takes place. You have to set up your long-term vision. To have some vision of the good towards which you're working, and some vision perhaps of the hell that you're avoiding. And then I would say, once you set up that vision so that you know how to orient yourself, then you should start designing your days. And you can do that very effectively with a calendar like Google Calendar. And instead of, many people say, well, I hate using a schedule, or I hate using a calendar. And what I would say about that is that if you hate using a schedule or a calendar, then you're probably using it wrong. What you're doing is using the calendar as an external tyrant that's telling you what you should do if you were going to be a conventionally good person each day. So you load yourself up with arbitrary, we'll say, arbitrary responsibilities. But that's not really how you should use a schedule. What you should use a schedule to do is to design the day that you would most like to have. And obviously that's going to include accepting some responsibility and undertaking to make progress on those things that you have to make progress on to keep your life from collapsing into chaos. but it should also mean that you schedule in activities that make you actually want to have that day. And so if you're using a schedule properly, that it can be your friend. And that can also be something that can increase your capacity to concentrate. And then I would say, well, if you're very scattered, then you can start to train yourself. You might say, well, I need to learn to read without distraction. So maybe what you do, you say, okay, well, for the next week, I'm going to read 10 minutes a day, and I'm going to try to limit the distractions. And if you're successful at that, then you could try 12 minutes a day. And if you're successful at that, you could try 15 minutes a day. And the trick is to set a goal for yourself that is slightly beyond your current level of performance, enough to be challenging, enough to be worthwhile if you accomplish, but not so difficult that you're likely to fail. I plan my day obsessively. My calendar is always absolutely full, and often weeks in advance. And I plan in the morning, especially when I'm on top of things. And I plan each hour, and I probably plan each minute. And yes, it leads to way higher productivity. You know, you decide what your goals are going to be. You place them in the calendar. Use the calendar as your friend, because what you want to do with the calendar is design a day that you want to have, or a day that would be good for you. And a day that would be good for you is one that you're when you end the day, you feel that you've moved yourself ahead towards your valued goals, and that you've kept chaos under control. And that enables you to sleep soundly and with a good conscience, and to know that the next day is going to be at least not worse than that day. Planning is unbelievably useful. You need to figure out what it is that you're aiming at and why, and then you need to figure out how you're going to break that down over the months and the weeks and the days. But I would approach your calendar like it's your best friend. You think, okay, I'm going to design a week, man, that I really want to have. And that means you can schedule in leisure and all the things that you want to do, which you absolutely should do. Learning to plan is unbelievably useful, to schedule your time, because that's your life, but schedule the life you want. That means you have to schedule your responsibilities obviously, because responsibilities are those things that ruin your life if you don't fulfill them. Learn to use a calendar, like Google Calendar. Many of you out there do not use a calendar. Okay, a calendar is not a prison, and it's not a tyrant. Not if you use it properly. A calendar keeps anxiety at bay. It makes sure that you do what you need to do, which is important, because otherwise you fall behind. But if you use it properly, it's also helps you plan what you want to do. So I could say, well, lay out your damn calendar and design the days you would like to have. That's what your calendar is for. So you can put in all sorts of things in there you want to do and that would be good for you. And that's a really good way to start being more industrious. Make a plan. You need a plan for 3 years. You need a plan for the next year. You need a plan for the next 6 months. You need a plan for the next 3 months. You need a plan for the week. You need a plan for the day. You need a plan for the hour. All of that. I make lists constantly of what I have to do. And they're like daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. I've asked my undergraduates frequently how much time they waste per day, and general estimates are like 6 to 8 hours of time they regard themselves as wasting. Like, that's a whole career right there, right? So if you just stop wasting time, you can do a tremendous amount, especially if you also try to maximize efficiency. And I always found that incredibly motivating. A motivating game. How much can I do in the least amount of time possible? That's fun to try to do that, as far as I'm concerned. I know, that's maybe undoubtedly a temperamental thing, but if you're wired that way, that's a great meta strategy. Become efficient. I always asked my graduate students when they were designing experiments, they'd come with a proposal. I'd say to them, is there any way you could do this 10 times faster? What would you have to cut? What would you have to change to do this 10 times faster? And you can learn to do that. I also learned to force the task to fit the time. There's this dictum, work expands to fill the time allowed for its completion. Work expands to fill the time allowed for its completion. Well, there's a corollary to that, which is work becomes more efficient in proportion to the restrictions of time placed upon it. So if you say, well, this could take me 2 weeks, but I'm going to do the best job I could in 1 day, you'd be amazed you can get 90% of the way or 95% of the way or sometimes even farther in that day. So that's another way of becoming efficient. You know, if you only have 10 minutes to do something that should maybe take you 2 hours, maybe you can figure out how to do it in 10 minutes. You can get dreadfully efficient. So that's very much worthwhile in my estimation. If you want to do a lot of things, what else are you going to do? You know, rather than become efficient, if you want to do many things, you don't have much choice. But I found it extremely entertaining to try to do that. I've often thought there's these 7 things that people have to get approximately right. You know, we went through some of them. You need an intimate relationship, family, job or career. You have to take care of yourself mentally and physically, your health. You have to regulate your drug and alcohol use. You have to use your work time productively outside of work. There's one other I often mention, I can't remember it now. It's an arbitrary list in some sense, but if you don't have a list, it's a good one. And maybe you can pick one of those things and work on them. And if you have all of those things, your life is likely to be better. You know, maybe you're a true radical and you have to live in a way that isn't traditional, and you don't need any of that. Highly improbable that that's true. And God only knows how you're going to find your own way. But until you know that for certain, it's not such a bad idea to adopt an apprenticeship in at least one of these areas. And you know, the purpose of being an apprentice isn't so that you're a slave, it's so that you become capable of your masterpiece, of transcending the discipline. So the idea is, look, there's lots of disciplinary strategies, there's lots of games you could play. And so you can fall into a moral relativism, say, well, all games are equal. It's like, well, no, but even if that's true, the fact that you need a game, that isn't relative. That's true. You need a game. Pick a game. Which game? Anyone is better than none. Play it hard. See what happens. You'll change as a consequence of the pursuit. And I think you have to be in very dire straits before that won't work. You can be in straits that are so dire that you can't move forward. But generally, you're somewhere that you could improve in some manner.
Is just getting people to believe that, is that harder than actually doing it in some ways? That we seem to be, there's so many young people that just feel so lost that just convincing them to do it is in some ways more important than doing it.
Well, I don't think you can convince them exactly, but you can ask them. It's like, okay, well, think about your life. And I do think I addressed this directly in that chapter. Remember sometime you accomplished something difficult. Well, was that good or not? And generally, the human experience, as far as I can tell, is that when you've accomplished something difficult, you regard that as worthwhile. So, okay, so look, so then you say, and this is a therapeutic technique in some sense, because you don't try to convince people, you get them to look at their own experience. It's like, well, it turns out that in your life, when you've done something that stretched you beyond where you were, so that was difficult, that you regarded that as worthwhile. Okay, so let's assume that that's true and that can be duplicated.
Most people have problems in living, they don't have psychological problems. And so I've experienced, despite my love for the psychoanalysts, very frequently what I'm doing as a therapist is helping people have a life that would work. You know, and you can parameterize that. It's like, what do you need? How about some friends? That people kind of like that. How about an intimate relationship with someone that you can trust, that maybe has a future? That'd be good. How about a career that puts you in a dominance hierarchy somewhere, so at least you've got some possibility of rising, some possibility of stabilizing yourself, and a schedule and a routine, because no one can live without a routine. You just forget that. If you guys don't have a routine, I would recommend, like, you get one going, because you cannot be mentally healthy without a routine. You need to pick a time to get up. Whatever time you want, but pick one and stick to it, because otherwise you dysregulate your circadian rhythms and they regulate your mood. And eat something in the morning. I've had lots of clients who've had anxiety disorders. I had one client who was literally starving. Very smart girl. There was very little that she liked. She kind of tried to subsist on like half a cup of rice a day. She came to me and said, I have no energy. I come home, all I want to do is watch the same movie over and over. What, like, is that weird? And I thought, well, it depends on how hard you work. You know, it's a little weird, but whatever. It's familiar. You're looking for comfort. So I did an analysis of her diet. It's like 3/4 of a cup of rice. It's like, you're starving. Eat something. You know, you'll feel better. So she modified her diet and all her anxiety went away and she had some energy. It's like, yeah, you gotta eat. So a schedule, that's a good thing, man. Your brain will thank you for it. It will stabilize your nervous system. With a bit of a plan, that's a good thing. You need a career, you need something productive to do with your time. You need to regulate your use of drugs and alcohol, most particularly alcohol, because that does in a lot of people. You need a family, like the family you have, your parents and all that. It'd be nice if you all got along, you could work on that. That's a good thing to work on. And then, you know, you probably need children at some point, and that's life. That's what life is. And if you're missing, you know, you may have a good reason to not be operating on one of those dimensions. It's not mandatory, but I can tell you that if you're not operating reasonably well on 4, I think I mentioned 6, if you're not operating reasonably well on at least 3 of them, there's no way you're going to be psychologically thriving. And that's more pragmatic in some sense than psychological, right? Human beings have a nature, there's things we need. And if we have them, well, that's good. And if we don't have them, well, then we feel the lack. And so behaviorists, behavioral psychologists concentrate a lot more on that sort of thing. You know, it's practical. It's like strategizing. Make a career plan. Figure out how to negotiate, because that's bloody important. Figure out how to say what you need. Figure out how to tell the truth to people. Figure out how to listen to your partner in particular, because if you listen to them, they will actually tell you what they want, and sometimes you can give it to them and maybe they'll return the favor. And if you practice that for like 15 years, well, then maybe you're constantly giving each other what you want. Well, hooray, that would be good. And then there's 2 of you under both circumstances, and it's better to have 2 brains than 1, because people think differently because of their temperament mostly. And so the negotiation is where the wisdom arises, and it's part of the transformation, the psychological transformation that's attendant on an intimate relationship, and one of the fundamental purposes of a long-term intimate relationship.
Try to make one room in your home as beautiful as possible. See something around you.
I think that might be my favorite chapter.
Yeah. Well, you've got some interesting artistic taste.
Yeah, I suppose. That's a chapter about the value of beauty as a marker for the transcendent. And it's great. You want to establish a relationship with things that sustain you. Truth, the great verities, truth, beauty. Beauty is difficult to define, but it's an invitation to the transcendent, essentially. Because beauty speaks of the ideal, and it impacts you beyond thought. It's visceral beauty, and that's an indication of the power of the ideal. And if you try to establish a relationship with beauty, and so to do that, you can make one corner of your room beautiful. If you can, you start to play with the idea of beauty. You start to learn to discriminate between what's beautiful and what isn't. And then you invite that into your life. And that's a terrifying thing to some degree, because beauty is very powerful, partly because it reminds you of who you aren't. But it's amazingly worthwhile. And it's sort of the next step beyond cleaning up your room. You know, make it orderly, but then the next step is make it beautiful. Oh yes, I mean alcohol is a very bad drug for violence. 50% of people who are murdered are drunk. And 50% of the people who murder them are drunk. And that's true for almost every violent crime. In fact, if you eliminated alcohol, you'd eliminate most interpersonal violence.
Look, I find that this is kind of an interesting topic because I think it's interesting that alcohol is legal. Mm-hmm. And yet, you know, you do terrible things sometimes.
You probably couldn't have made any a worse drug legal.
Right.
From an epidemiological perspective.
On the other hand, you have marijuana or psilocybin or LSD even, or some of these other drugs, and they make you thirsty, make you laugh, and you wake up feeling fine. I find it really fascinating that alcohol is the illegal one. How did that ever happen or is the legal one? Why does our system
I think
work?
it probably happened because it was so easy to make and it was just everywhere. Right? Because all you really have to do is put barley in water and you get beer, right? So it was really easy to make, and at least in many societies, it's been around for a very long time. And so it became legal just because, well, back in the Middle Ages, people drank alcohol, not water, because all the water was polluted.
Right.
Right. So that's the reason, but it certainly wasn't a consequence of evaluating the drugs by their comparative risk and rank ordering them and making, the least harmful legal. It wasn't that at all, because alcohol is unbelievably dangerous. I mean, about 10% of people become addicted to it one way or another.
Really?
And far more people than that abuse it. Yes, at least once in their life, yes. Yeah. It's really bad. I studied alcohol for years. It was my subject of my PhD.
We were interested in what factors made alcoholism hereditary, because it does seem to have a strong hereditary component. And what we basically concluded after doing a tremendous amount of research was that people who are prone to alcoholism, at least one type of person who's prone to one type of alcoholism, got a very, very powerful stimulant effect from the alcohol during the time that their blood alcohol level was ascending in the 10 or 15 minutes after they took a drink, especially if they took a large drink fast or multiple large drinks fast. You can probably tell, by the way, if you're one of these people, if you want to go do this in the bar the next time you go on an empty stomach, take your pulse, write it down, drink 3 or 4 shots fast, wait 10 minutes, take your pulse again. If it's gone up 10 or 15 beats a minute, look out, because that means alcohol is working as a psychomotor stimulant for you. And we found that for many of these people, that was an opiate effect. What seemed to happen was that when they drank alcohol fast, they produced probably beta endorphin, although we were never sure. It can be blocked with naltrexone, which is an opiate antagonist. Anyways, the other characteristic of that pattern of alcohol consumption is that the real kick only occurs when you're on the ascending limb of the blood alcohol curve. So, first of all, your blood alcohol goes up, and then it goes down. And generally, when it goes down, it's not pleasant. That's when you start to feel hungover. And hangover is actually alcohol withdrawal, by the way. So it's like heroin withdrawal, except it's alcohol withdrawal. And it's generally not pleasant for people, so they usually sleep through it, or it puts them to sleep. But if you're one of these people who get a real kick on the ascending limb of the blood alcohol curve, then you can just keep pounding back the alcohol, and it'll keep hitting you and keep you in that position where you're on the ascending part of the blood alcohol curve. And you can probably tell if you're one of these people if you can't stop once you get started. So if it's like you have 4 drinks quick, and it's like, man, you're gone until the alcohol runs out, or till it's 4 a.m, or till you've spent all your money, or you've been at the last bar in town, or that you're sitting on your friend's bed after everybody's gone home from the party and you're still drinking, you might suspect that you're one of those people. And if you are one of those people, well, then you should watch the hell out, because alcohol is a vicious drug, and it gets people in its grasp hard, and it's hard for them to escape once they do.
They don't have a value hierarchy. So Pleasure Island, it's a good example. Those kids that were brought there were lost. So they didn't have anywhere to go. They didn't have an identity. So they default to local pleasure. And that's better than none. Although the problem with local pleasure, well, as the narrative made clear, is that
you better look out if you're impulsive, because it's going to kick back on you hard. And the reason is, you're only considering the immediate time frame. And the problem is that things propagate across all the time frames. And so just because something works really well this second, cocaine for example, doesn't mean that it's a tenable solution to the class of all problems. So usually, often, people pursue local pleasure because that's the best they can imagine, it's the best they've been taught, they don't see another alternative. So it could be ignorance, it can be they don't want to adopt the responsibility, because part of the problem with working at every level of the hierarchy simultaneously is that it's like dancing to a very complex waltz, let's say. You have to be paying attention to a very large number of things simultaneously and doing things right. It requires responsibility. And so, you know, it's a pain, it's a weight. Part of the reason people drink alcohol is to get rid of their responsibility. I mean, that's, you know, you hear people drink because they have problems. It's like, yeah, no. Some people drink because they're anxious, and alcoholics drink because they're in withdrawal. But young people drink because they're sick and tired of being responsible, because it's annoying. It's like, so I'll drink enough, I won't care about the medium to long-term consequences, because alcohol, that's exactly what alcohol does. It doesn't make you ignorant of the medium to long-term consequences, but it makes you not care about them. And partly it's because it dampens anxiety. So it dampens anxiety, leaves your positive emotion circuits intact, so then you can go out there and do stupid fun things. And that's a party, really. Let's go do stupid fun things. That's a party. But the medium to long-term consequences it's risky. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it's risky. So, yeah, they don't know better. That's the answer, I would say.
Like, make a plan. I would say do the future authoring program, you know, because it isn't that you're trying to avoid booze exactly. It's that you're trying to restructure your whole life, you know, because if you're a drinker, then all your friends are drinkers, and you're used to drinking in every social situation, and the places that you go to socialize are places that you drink, and like, it's really built in as a whole set of habits. And so what you have to do is kind of redesign your life, and you have to think of things. You can't just stop drinking. You have to figure out what you're going to start doing instead of drinking. There's a hole that you have to fill in. And, you know, the future authoring program will also help you figure out what your life could look like in the absence of alcohol, and what kind of hell you could end up in if you keep drinking and it causes all the problems that it can cause. And I think you really need to, you need to think through the hell that can occur, and you have to think through how your life could be valuable without alcohol, so that you can be motivated enough to try to regulate it. And I would also say, if you fail and slip, don't berate yourself and beat yourself up. Just start quitting again, because, you know, if you could cut your alcohol intake down 75%, that's a hell of a lot better than zero. And often people go all or nothing, just like they do when they're quitting cigarettes. And, you know, they'll quit for a month and then have a cigarette, and they'll say, oh my God, now I've broken the pact, and then they'll smoke a whole pack and they'll be smoking again. You don't have to do that. You can just decide that you slipped and that you're gonna get back on the wagon again. And, you know, it can take a long time, but I do believe that you need a better vision of life, right? You have to find something to do that's better than alcohol. And that might take some real consideration, especially if alcohol is a very potent drug for you. And I would also say, don't hesitate to try the naltrexone. It's got a pretty decent clinical history, and it's basically harmless. What's the best way to stop drinking alcohol and start doing my best in my psychology degree? It's affecting my study, but I can do very well if I stop. I'm 26. Well, Paul, what I would say is, I think you should do the future authoring program, and you should really concentrate. There's a section in it that helps you determine what your positive view of your future would be, but another section that helps you determine what would happen in your life if your negative habits got out of control. And one of the things that can really help you control your alcohol intake is to really, really think through what you're giving up and where you could be in 5 years if you don't get it under control. And a proclivity to alcoholism can be a really vicious thing. You know, lots of people get dragged down into the mud by alcohol, excess alcohol intake, especially if they're sensitive to the opiate response that alcohol can produce. And you can tell that when you drink, you know, you get alert and let's say more enthusiastic and energetic, and then you don't want to stop drinking. That's definitely a bad sign with regards to developing alcoholism. So I would say you need to figure out something that's more important to you than drinking. Think through very hard the negative consequences of continuing it. You're at about the age, 26, where you should stop. I mean, guys who are going to stop generally start to slow down pretty intensely around that age. You know, also treating your psychology studying as a full-time job can also be helpful. So, you know, get up at 8 in the morning or 7:30 in the morning and start hitting the books by 9 and put in a 6 to 8 hour day. And then even if you do keep drinking, at least you're moving forward. So that's what I would say about that.
Responsibility, I think, is an incredible message.
Yeah, the responsibility element has been well received by people, and I think maybe that's because that message isn't being delivered as effectively as it should be. The idea that meaning is to be found in responsibility.
Yeah, you're saying it hasn't been developed. You're saying it hasn't been promoted as much.
Well, there's so much of an emphasis on rights. I mean, imagine if our culture was as dominated by discussion of responsibility as it was dominated by discussion of rights.
Gosh,
Be
right.
completely. I mean, that's just not how it is at all.
Right.
And that's strange because your rights, in some sense, are my responsibility, and vice versa. So, right, because your accorded rights, it's distance from other people in some sense. And for them, it's the same. And so you can't have one discussion without the other.
Mm-hmm.
But our discussion has been very one-sided. And I think that's hard on people because it's about what you're owed.
Yeah.
And it isn't obvious to me that, I don't know, it's not like not getting what you're owed isn't annoying. It is if you feel that an injustice has been
Right.
committed. But
Right.
it isn't obvious to me that people find the deepest meaning in their life in getting what they're owed. I really do think that people find more significance in their life in being of use, utility, and service to other people. That's how it looks to me. So, and often that's discussed in a sort of should way, you know, you should be good to other people. It's like, well, your life is better if you do that. That's a different way of putting it. And you can get people to think about that. It's like, well, remember those times when people were particularly happy with something that you did, something for them. How did you feel about that? Well, you can figure that out for yourself. Maybe it didn't matter, but probably it mattered. Probably you'd like to have that happen a lot more.
But I think even
So-
more so the feeling that you get when you have a responsibility and you deliver on it.
Mhm.
I think that, for me, that feels even more meaningful. That you uphold your end of the bargain, that you make someone's life better. That feels even better than when someone says, thank you for that. Thank you for doing that. Like,
Right. No, absolutely. No, I wasn't thinking so much about the consequences of the thanks. That's just an indication that you did something, you know, that was productive and useful and caring, let's say. And yeah, and I think people know that too, that when they're operating properly, parents find tremendous meaning in the service they provide to their children, obviously. And I think you find that within a relationship, what you give. I mean, it's reciprocal, obviously. There has to be reciprocity, but it's better to concentrate at least half the time on what you're giving. I don't think that young people, especially in later days in junior high school, maybe even earlier than that, are taught enough to think about what they want and how they would go about getting it. And I mean what they want in a deep sense, like how their friendships could be better, how their relationships with their parents could be better, how their life could be better, practically speaking. So we tried to design a program to help younger people do the self-authoring program, but my health interfered with that and it fell by the wayside, unfortunately. But it's helpful for people to take stock of themselves and to chart a course. And I don't think our education system does a very good job of helping people develop a vision of themselves, a story for themselves. And it's a problem because it also means that they're not ennobled or encouraged the way they should be. And I've seen this all constantly during my lectures, that people are so happy to be encouraged. They're often met with skepticism instead, and I think that's part of the problem with what's happening in our culture politically too, is that, you know, there's this terrible critique of our culture that all its institutions are fundamentally predicated on arbitrary power, the exercise of arbitrary power. And that implies that the ambitions of people who wish to join that culture and to thrive are expressions of tyrannical, oppressive, arbitrary power. It's very demoralizing to young people. And I don't believe it's true, because I don't think the fundamental motivation is to exploit others. I think that people who do that fail, generally speaking, often precipitously. Societies that organize themselves around that principle are miserable and collapse. They're full of deceit and backstabbing and distrust. It's hell. And so I think that young people are best encouraged. And that means that you actually have to sort of like them. Like you're a mentor. It's like, I'm really on the side of the good in you, and I hope it manifests itself. And I think that's what trust is for, by the way. You know, you should trust other people. Why? They can bite. Why would you trust them? Well, because it's courageous to. And that way you elicit the best from them. At least that's the best opportunity you have. You're going to get hurt sometime. You're going to get hurt distrusting too. But societies without trust are hell on earth. So
Trusting
that's for sure.
Next generation, though, starts with you having it in the first place, right? That's sort of passing along those patterns. As if I don't trust anyone, I'm going to instill that in my child. Like, well, the world's not to be trusted.
You can try to change that, you know, and if you know that trust is courage, that can help. Because, well, trust can be just naivety. I trust you because I'm too foolish to know the difference, you know. I've never been hurt. I've never encountered someone malevolent, so I'm naive. And I trust. That's not trust. That's blind faith in an environment that's been too benevolent for your own good. But trust, that's more like, well, we'll think the best of you to begin with and see what happens. And then if you make a mistake, well, we'll deal with that and we'll go back to trust. And those are stable negotiating strategies. And so that's, young people need to be confronted with that, and then they need to be helped to chart their course. And that's hard, you know, it takes a fair bit of individual attention because people are so complicated. I produced this other technology at Self-Authoring that helps people write about their past, analyze their faults and their virtues, and write a plan for the future. It's a useful way of figuring out who you are. You kind of have to hit yourself against the world, but you know, you tell the story about your past, and that helps you understand where you came from. You figure out your virtues and your faults. That sort of helps you understand your strengths and weaknesses. And then a plan gives you a course for the future. It's hard to do all that writing, but it's hard to blunder through life too without a plan. So it's hard either way.
Pick your hard. You always talk about that. Choose the difficult, or the difficult will choose you eventually, and you might not like it as much, right?
Yeah, well, when it's necessary. Like, I wouldn't say to go out of your way necessarily to make your life difficult, but if you have a difficult choice in front of you and it's either abandon what you know you should be doing or do the difficult thing, well, you're going to pay a price for abandonment. So And I guess I would also say that to understand yourself, it's quite useful to try to not lie, because you tangle yourself up in your own lies. People think they can get away with lying, but you can't get away with falsifying the structure of the world. You're going to pay for it. I've never seen anybody get away with anything in my clinical practice. No, the other shoe always dropped. Always. And unsurprisingly, if you drop a weight on your head, above your head, like, it's fine until it hits you. Yeah.
But then there's changing your mind.
Yeah, you can be wrong. That's different. That's a good point, though. It's difficult to dissociate ignorance from lying, but, you get punished when you're wrong often, but that's different, It's not like it's nothing to be ignorant, to be wrong. It's still hard on you, but it's a different kind of hard to be willfully wrong. One of the real advantages, I think a lot of the current political movements are quasi-religions, essentially, and religious structures have collapsed very badly, and so these things arise to take their place, because we need a religious structure, because that's what provides us with our fundamental story. The fundamental story of life is a religious story, by definition. That's what I mean by that. Is the most fundamental story you have is the closest thing you have to a religion. So
We started there. We started with the stories.
yes. Well, and metaphysics be damned, but I don't know what the fundamental significance of consciousness is, and neither does anybody else. So there's plenty of room for metaphysical speculation. It's hard to know what each person's destiny is, but in any case, the problem with so many ideological stories is that they give you an easy enemy. And that's extremely dangerous. And maybe the enemy, they always give you an enemy. Yeah, that's a real problem.
So that seems like one of the biggest problems, is there's always an enemy.
Well, the biggest problem is the enemy isn't you. You're your worst enemy.
I agree.
That's the right place to start. And so, one of the advantages, I think, of Christianity, although I don't think it's limited to Christianity, is that it insists that that's the battleground. You. Right? And so if you need an enemy, and maybe you do, look within. So there's a New Testament idea that you should turn the other cheek, and that's a very tough one to contend with, because it's not easy to separate out that from the appearance of weakness, let's say, because you want to be able to stand up and defend yourself. Obviously, there's no credibility unless you're capable of doing that. You have no credibility unless you're capable of doing that. In the interview that you're referring to, I attempted to use minimal necessary force, and all I was doing was deflecting accusations that, as far as I was concerned, had nothing to do with me. And the reason that was successful was exactly because there was no obliteration. There was just stepping back, say, well, that's not accurate the way that you're formulating that. And what happened was that she had to show her hand, and it was her showing her hand that produced the consequences that were associated with that video, which I think has been viewed, the video itself, about 11 million times, and the various clips and cuts is probably 50 million by now. But because I didn't use force or any more than was necessary, then she had to keep stepping forward with her accusations and her ideology, and she just laid it out completely so that everyone could see it. And so it's another thing you really want to think about. Like, you don't want to be thinking about this as a polarized political battle, because you're in the damn polarized political battle, and it's actually the polarized political battle that's the problem. Now, now it's not like, as I said already, it's not like you want to be a pushover, but you step away from that and you work on yourself so that you're an increasingly powerful person. But one of the ways that you do that is that you learn to use minimal necessary force. It's like you don't defend yourself any more than you have to. Like, be careful. Don't push any harder than you need to, because all you do is you generate a counterforce by pushing harder than you need to, and then you're in conflict. And you think, well, I like a little conflict. It's like, look, fair enough, a little conflict, man, no problem. It keeps your life kind of interesting, and maybe that's on the problem-solving edge. But a little conflict can become a lot of conflict very, very rapidly. And if you have any sense at all, that's not what you want. You know, especially if you have other things that are better to do, and you should have other things that are better to do. And so, you know, to deal with these sorts of things, even when you're provoked with a light hand, there is no more effective strategy than that. And it's a real mark of sophistication and your ability to keep your temper in check. It's really something to aim at. And that's true even when you're dealing with yourself. You know, you don't punish yourself any more than necessary. When you're negotiating with someone that you love, a partner, for example, or a husband or a wife, at least in principle, you defend yourself with minimum necessary force. When I've been successful in responding to attacks, it's only because I've responded to them minimally. So, for example, there's been a number of times when I've gone to universities and had pretty nasty demonstrations. There was one at McMaster University that got quite out of hand, and a worse one at Queen's University, where people were pounding on the windows while we were all sitting in the hall. But it was the same thing there. It's like control of temper, detachment, understanding that the full event has yet to play itself out, the ability to step back, and the requirement to use minimal necessary force. And when I've been able to manage that, then it's worked. And if my temper gets riled up, and I have a temper, and if it gets riled up and I start to lash out more than necessary, then that goes badly right away. And I can see that in the comments, and I can see that the memes that are made of me turn a little bit more mean instead of funny. And so this is really an important thing to know. It's like, keep your temper under control. Don't burst out into self-righteous anger, in particular against those that you might regard as your political enemies. It is not going to help you. It's not going to help the cause. It's not going to help anything. You can accomplish what you want to accomplish if you're being wise about it by being eminently reasonable. That's the thing, is you can have reason on your side, and I mean reason in the best possible sense. It's like you don't have to be temperamental and impulsive in this sort of situation. You can try to put yourself together, which I would highly recommend, and then you can lay yourself open to the attacks. Now, that means you should be able to defend yourself. You should have the articulated structures at hand. You should orient yourself properly, politically and philosophically, and even physically for that matter, so that you're a force to contend with. But once you have that down, then you play it with the lightest possible hand. And that way also you have the highest probability of let's say, of changing the minds of people who are possessed by an ideology so that they can rejoin the productive political dialogue. And that's what you want. You don't want to defeat them. First of all, good luck with that. It's like, well, you've got to live with them. You can't defeat people that you live with, because there they are the next day. And if you defeat them, well, then they're defeated. And maybe that's not for the best. And second, it's not like they're happy about the fact that they're defeated. It's not like they're not going to be waiting around to find out when they can defeat you next. It's like if you're married to someone, think, well, I won that argument. It's like, no, you didn't. No, you didn't, because there that person is, waking up next to you the next day. And so if you won, you know, and they're defeated and humiliated because of it, then the probability that they're going to react properly to you, if they have any sense at all, is very low. And so what you want is you want to negotiate your way to a sustainable peace. And that's what you want to do in the political realm too, because, well, in this country, you know, there's a certain amount of polarization. I don't think it's anywhere near as bad as the media is making it out to be as they go through their death spirals and generate clickbait like mad. Because, you know, in the US, you guys have been voting 50% Republican and 50% Democrat for what, about 20 years, right down the middle. It hasn't changed that much. But these people who are on the opposite side of the political spectrum from you, they're the people who live across the street. They're the people who live down the street. They're family members, for that matter. And you're going to have to live with them. It's like you don't want to defeat them. You want to bring them back into the reasonable political dialogue. And you do that by having a certain amount, first of all, by getting your act together so that you're a credible and admirable person. But then by having some forbearance and negotiating towards peace. Think about what you want as a victory. You want a victory that where you're surrounded by the corpses of your defeated enemies, Or do you want a victory that constitutes peace? Well, that's what you want. And in this country, I mean, you've been able to maintain that for a very long period of time, excluding the Civil War, let's say. And there's been other periods of polarization, like in the early 1970s. You don't want this to be a victory. You want this, not in that sense. You want to decrease the polarization, to bring everyone back under the umbrella of intelligent conversation. And you want to also know that just as you perhaps are temperamentally predisposed, being more conservative, to standing for patriotism, standing for the what would you say, well, let's say patriotism, we'll leave it at that, and for the utility of hierarchies, that there are people who need to speak for the dispossessed, and you have to engage in a dialogue with them for your own good as well as theirs. Because healthy hierarchies do take care of the people who are dispossessed by the hierarchies, and that's one of the things that makes them stable. It's not an easy thing to figure out how to do, right? I mean, you don't do it self-evidently by things like redistribution of income, but it's still a universal. The problem of the dispossessed is a universal problem, and it has to be addressed, and that's why you need the political dialogue. So no victory, peace is the goal, not victory. If you can communicate in those means, speaking, writing, and if you can think, you are so powerful that nothing can stop you. You think about it, well, what do you mean? Well, I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're a plumber or a waitress. Not that there's anything wrong with being a plumber or a waitress, because there isn't. It's like you're going to negotiate for a raise. You're going to negotiate for a promotion. You're going to negotiate how your customers treat you. You're going to negotiate how you advertise yourself, for example, with regards to picking up customers. That's all articulated linguistic ability, the ability to express yourself. If you're good at that, you win, period. And so, right, look, there's a reason, like the children of rich people took liberal arts degrees. Why? Because the rich knew that that was the best possible training for leadership positions. And it wasn't because it was a romp through the park for 4 years and then daddy's inheritance. It was because if you learned how to communicate, you were unstoppable.
My sense, and I did a lot of clinical work with high-performing people and had a chance to observe them in academia among my peers, but also, and among graduate students, but also in the broader business and professional world. And it takes a singular combination of traits to be a C-suite person or the equivalent. And one thing is incredible efficiency and persistence. So not only are you working 80 hours a week, you do that all the time, and you do it non-stop. So it's not like, you talk to an undergraduate and he says, or she says, I spent 8 hours in the library yesterday studying, and then you do a little microanalysis and you find out that really they spent, 40 minutes studying maybe, and 7.5 hours wasting time. But the people that occupy those C-suite positions, they're actually working all that time. And they've trained them, and well, they have the temperament, they're very likely to be conscientious. So they start with that. And perhaps that was also fostered in their household, because that does help. So here's an example of that. So the children of first-generation Asian immigrants are disproportionately successful. And it looks like the reason for that is something like socialization for conscientiousness. And that seems to produce the equivalent of about a 15-point IQ advantage, which is about the difference between the typical college graduate and the typical university or high school graduate. It's a big difference. It's a big, one standard deviation. So, to be a CEO or to be hyper successful, you have to be, let's say, 2 to 3 standard deviations or more above the mean for IQ. So that wipes out like 85% of the population right off the bat, or 95% really. And then you have to be in the 95th percentile for conscientiousness, and those are uncorrelated. So that's 5% of 5% with the first 2 cuts. So there's a singular personalities that end up in those situations. And I think, that there's an added advantage that men have motivationally to pursue those jobs. And the advantage is that
status confers upon males sexual attractiveness. Status within the patriarchal hierarchy, let's say. So women are much more likely to choose high status men, assuming that the definition of status is defined by the hierarchy within which they're competing. Okay. Men have zero preference for women who are high status in that way. Or actually the correlation is slightly negative. And so to be a CEO and be a woman means that you have to have all those personality attributes, but then you don't gain this tremendous reproductive advantage. And I think that advantage is so marked that it's actually built into men. It's not only motivating consciously, if I'm successful, I'll be more successful with women. It's built in biologically.
Well, and you want status among your fellow males too, like athletes compete against each other. And you want to get the respect of your fellow males, say in your group, at least, I mean, speaking as a male.
Look, I had this roommate, he came from Alberta like me, so he was a small town rural guy. And he went to McGill and then went off to New York. He's very, very smart. Rough guy, very adventurous guy. Went off to New York, became a corporate lawyer. And his plan was to go to New York, make a pile of money, and then go travel. Like he went up the Amazon. He went into China when so few Caucasians had gone there that they had to put him in jail in one part of China because he got mobbed so badly. It was the only place, because people were curious about him, it was the only place they could put him that was safe. So in any case, he was going to go to New York and make a bunch of money and then be his adventurous self. But, you know, you go to New York and you adopt a job, one of those high pressure jobs in a top law firm, and the socialization pressure is so intense, you've never experienced anything like it in your life. And if you do that for 10 years, you're a corporate lawyer. You're not whoever you were to begin with. Maybe the conscientiousness remains. And so I saw him about 15 years later, and it was so funny because when he walked into the restaurant, he had a high-powered New York suit on. He was a really sharp-looking guy, and he looked the part exactly. And I thought, geez, I look just like a professor because I had my tweed jacket on and my leather jacket. I was much more casual, and I thought we really became what we pursued. And so these trade-offs that you talk about, they're real, right? They're real. You sacrifice much of what you could be for who you are going to be. And that's a good sacrifice because you should become something, but it's still a real sacrifice. I know a bunch of people who run MBA programs, and I've had discussions with them because the thing about an MBA program is if it's selective, it's really hard to get in. It's like getting into Harvard. It's really hard to get into Harvard. You have to have an IQ that places you at least at the 99th percentile, and then you have to be really good at least one or two other things. So it's really hard to get in. Okay, so you think, well, why hire a Harvard graduate? Well, it's the quality of the education. It's like, no, it's not. It's the fact that it's really hard to get in. All of the value of the Ivy League education is in the screening before the education starts. Now, that doesn't mean that people go to Harvard and they get educated, but they'd get just as educated if they went somewhere else. First of all, it's like every university contains more information than any student can ever possibly process. If you're super smart, you can be dropped into a state college somewhere, a low-level state college. You just spend 4 years in the library. You know, like, what are you going to do, read the whole library? No. Right, so and the data on this is quite clear. It's like, and it's the same with private schools. The reason that people who go to private schools do better than people who go to public schools is because, generally speaking, the people who go into private schools are smarter. It's not the education that's any better. And so we radically overestimate the degree to which training works. So now you can train people to be stupid, but training them to be smarter than they are is really, really, really hard. So, like I said, it's a dismal literature. And the liberals think everyone's roughly equal and there's a job for everyone, you just have to train them. It's like, no, wrong. And the conservatives think, well, there's a job for everyone if they just get off their ass and work. It's like, no, that's wrong too. Even though if you work, that's better. And, well, so that's on the conservative end, but the liberals won't take into account individual differences. Well, obviously, that's part of what the whole politically correct discussion is about. It's like everyone's the same. It's like, yeah, they're not. And I find it's really annoying, I would say. Like, I love to come to Silicon Valley. I've been here many, many times, and like, it's really something to come here and meet. There's so many people here who are off the scales intelligent, and they're all, clustered together, which is why this place is so unbelievably rich and so unbelievably productive, one of the reasons. But it's also very annoying that it's so left-leaning, because one of the things that the left-leaning Silicon Valley geniuses should understand is that they're the beneficiary of a genetic lottery. Mm-hmm. And they should take that seriously. It's like, yeah, you worked hard. Yes, you're entrepreneurial. Yes, you're on point. You put in your 60 hours a week. You do everything you could. But you have an IQ of 150. And like, that's not your doing, mm-hmm. right? That's something that happened to you. And so you can't be saying, well, it's all me. It's like, no, It's not. It's all you and the genius that you were granted as an infant. That's it. That's what's driving it. Now, that doesn't mean, I think, that people of disproportionate intelligence shouldn't be rewarded disproportionately. It's possible that they should, because it might be in the best interest of everyone else to dump as much money as possible to the top 2% of the cognitive strata, because they're going to be most generative with it. And even if it's not fair, because you might say, well, just because you won the genetic lottery, does that mean that you should have more money than anyone else? It's like, well, not on the grounds of fairness, but if you have to distribute money, well, who are you going to distribute it to? And I think, was it Ted, who ran CNN? Ted Turner. Mm-hmm. He estimated that if you tried as hard as you could in your entire life, there was no way that you could spend more than $400 million. And so let's say you have more money than that at your disposal. Well, hopefully you're going to do some halfway intelligent things with it, and hopefully you'd expect that the more intelligent people would do more than halfway intelligent things with it. So if you have to have unequal distribution, then a meritocracy is probably the best way to do it. But it still leaves you with this terrible problem, which is, what do you do with all the people who stack up at zero? And the answer isn't have contempt for them because they don't work as hard as you. It's like, yeah, a bunch of them don't. Because conscientiousness also predicts success. So among the poor, there are people who don't work, but you never want to underestimate the contribution of cognitive ability. So it's rough, man, and we don't take it seriously, and we don't know what to do about it. And it's clear that as inequality increases, societies destabilize. That's clear. So it's something that has to be dealt with, but we don't know how to deal with it. We don't know how to efficiently move resources to the bottom end of the competence hierarchy. And I've worked with people, lots of people who are at the bottom end of the hierarchy in my clinical practice. And like cocaine addicts, for example, low IQ cocaine addicts. Not all cocaine addicts have low IQ, by the way, but it's just it's a triple whammy, let's say, because if you're a cocaine addict, you're probably also an alcoholic. And so if you're a cocaine addict and you're an alcoholic and you're sort of on the low end of the cognitive distribution, it's like you have a pretty damn rough life. There's a lot of things going wrong for you. And you're really lucky if you're flat broke, because as soon as you get money, you are so done, you cannot believe it. So like when your unemployment check comes in and you're a cocaine addict alcoholic who isn't employed, the probability that 3 days later you're going to end up face down in a ditch is really, really high. So don't be thinking like it's not so simple that you can just dump money down the competence hierarchy to the people who are in the underclass and expect that that's going to have a salutary effect. I don't think there's any evidence for that whatsoever. Like, money is not an easy resource to use productively.
If you were to pick, 3 rules for life that would lead you down a better path, what would they be?
Well, I think not saying things you know to be untrue. That's a good thing. Don't lie. That's good. Be grateful. And then try to work for the best in yourself and other people. And maybe even broader than that. Try to work for the best, despite your cynicism and resentment. I suppose that's a form of gratitude as well. That's what love means, fundamentally, is working for the best of things. And it's a goal. I mean, what's the alternative? Hate? And that's not going to make things better. It's going to make things worse. Oh, generally speaking. So something like truth nested inside of love. Then there's gratitude lurking around the edges. Beauty is important.
More art, right?
Yeah, well, more beauty, period. Everywhere. That would be nice. It's kind of intimidating, beauty.
What do you mean?
But,
What do you mean by that?
well, because it's an ideal. It judges you. This is something that's quite interesting, is every ideal is a judge. Right? Because
By
you fall
nature.
short of it. Yeah, but it's an interesting problem that you need an ideal to work towards, but the consequence of that is that you're judged by it.
That's fascinating because we always want the ideal, right?
Yeah, well, I recommend it to people that they try to reward themselves for improving over who they were yesterday, rather than punishing themselves for their deviation from the ideal. Look for incremental improvements and let yourself know that you've managed them.
Is it important to hold the ideal, but also then keep short-term goals of
Yes,
you
definitely.
against yourself?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, you want to break it down into, and you do this with kids too. You want to set someone a task that will stretch them beyond their limit, but not be impossible, right? So that's part of being intelligent and careful within a relationship, because it'd be nice to facilitate success. I mean, maybe it has to be punctuated by failure from time to time, but that's one of the things you do as a therapist, is try to set things up so that people succeed in moving towards their goals, and try to make the tasks small enough so that they're a reasonable probability that they will be completed successfully.
Well, so we live inside a damaged structure, and we also bear responsibility for that damage because we don't do everything we can to constantly repair it. And you might say, well, that's actually one of the fundamental, people say, well, what's the meaning of life? What they really mean is, what's the positive meaning of life? Because as we've already discussed, the negative meanings of life are more or less self-evident. Well, the positive meaning of life is to be found in noting the state of lack of repair of the walled city that you inhabit, and then sallying forth to do something about that, to repair the breaches and to fix up the walls and to make the structure that you inhabit as secure and as productive as it possibly can be. And there's no shortage of opportunities to do that. You can do that in your own mind, you can do that in your own room, you can do that in your own household, in your local community. And maybe if you get good at doing it at all those levels, then you can start to look beyond that. And so there's challenges. That's the thing that's kind of interesting about this insufficient structure, is that it has a set of challenges built into it because of its insufficiency, and perhaps even because of its corrupt nature, that calls forth the potential response from you of heroic adventure. And the heroic adventure is to man the barricades and repair the city. And you can always do that. It doesn't matter what your personal circumstances are. There's always something that isn't right near you, isn't correct, isn't laid out properly, that you could just fix if you wanted to. And one of the things that we're going to talk about tonight is the idea that if you adopt an attitude that's like that the role that you should play is to make things better wherever you are, however you can, that what would actually happen would be that things would get better wherever you are in all sorts of ways, and that we've really, as a species, you might say, or maybe even as singular individuals, we've explored that rarely. It isn't something that's put forth as a proposition that often, and it's quite surprising to me. And I had an interesting experience the other day. I went to the Keg. I go there because I have food allergies, and they're very careful with people who have food allergies. And the waiter took me to the table, and he said that he had been watching my lectures, and that's a very common experience. And he was happy about that, and he said that he'd had 2 promotions at the Keg in the last 4 months because he'd been watching my lectures, and like I really found that an affecting experience, because you might say, well, he's working as a waiter at the Keg and there's nothing particularly heroic about that, and I disagree with that, actually, because I don't care where you're located, you can do a hell of a job, and I mean that literally. At whatever job you have, you can take whatever job you have and you can make it a real nice little piece of absolute misery. Or you can act like a civilized human being and notice that no matter where you are, there's a richness and a complexity that's completely inexhaustible right at hand. And then you can take that seriously and you can say, well, I happen to be a waiter at the Keg, and perhaps that's not what I expected, and he's a young guy, and perhaps that isn't where I want to end up, but it's not nothing. It's a rich environment, and I can make it a lot better if I want to. I can get along properly with my coworkers and not gossip behind their back, and I can treat my customers properly, and if an opportunity comes my way, I can take it, and I can see what happens. And so he said that's what he had started doing, and that things were working out much better for him. He was in a much better job than he was 3 months ago. And 3 months, that's nothing, right? I mean, that's a nice trajectory. It's an uphill trajectory, and that's what you want, really. An uphill trajectory is actually even better than being somewhere good, as far as I'm concerned, because one of the things that really makes your life meaningful is the clear realization that you're headed somewhere better than you are now. And then it's even better if you also understand that there's a direct causal relationship between the things that you're doing and the steepness of that incline. And so I get a lot of letters from people like that, and they're most frequently young men, although not always. And they say, well, I've been listening to these lectures and I decided that I'm going to try to take responsibility for my life, and so I've started to stop doing all the stupid things that I know that are stupid, that I know I shouldn't be doing, and I've started doing some of the things that aren't stupid that I know I should be doing, which seems pretty obvious, really, if you think about it. But obvious though it may be, that isn't necessarily what people do. And then they write and say, you can't believe what difference that makes. And they're thrilled about it. And so I'm thrilled about it when I get letters like that, because I really don't experience anything as better than a letter like that or a message like that, because it's so good to see things that aren't so good replaced by something better. And I really do think it's an open question. I truly believe it's an open question to what degree we could make things better if that's what we actually aimed at doing. Life has a tragic element, because we're vulnerable, all of us, and we know it, which is the particularly human curse, let's say. We're aware of our vulnerability, and it's not just vulnerability in the tragic sense, it's also the human proclivity for evil that makes the tragedy of life even worse than it would otherwise have to be. And you could say that that's a basic truth. You could even say that that's a basic truth with regards to the meaning of life. It's a pessimistic way of looking at it in some sense, but it leads to an optimistic conclusion. All of us have to face our limitations and malevolence in the world, and the possibility that we'll be betrayed or betray other people and act improperly, and that's a heavy burden. But the truth of the matter is, as far as I'm concerned, that each of us has enough potential character, power of character, let's say, if it's properly manifested, to contend with that in a noble way and to rise above it and to transcend and to deal with it in large part, because we can make the world a much better place than it is for each of us individually and for our families and for our community. And we can constrain the malevolence, at least in our own hearts, and perhaps have a positive effect on those around us as a consequence. And that actually does make things better, and we actually can do that. And that's where the meaning in life is to be found. And that meaning, that goes along with the adoption of that kind of responsibility, is actually the antidote to the suffering. You know that perfectly well, because all of you need a reason to get out of bed in the morning, especially on a rough morning, when things aren't going so well in your life. And there will be plenty of times when things aren't going so well in your life. And you still need a reason to get up and get moving and get out there. And if you have adopted the responsibility at an individual level to make things better, given how bad they are, if you've adopted the responsibility to make things better, then you have a reason to get up. And so one of the things that I've been stressing to people is that there's very little difference between
the meaning in life that gives you fulfillment and that engages you in existence, and the willingness to shoulder as much individual responsibility as you can possibly handle. Those are the same things. And that's a really useful thing to know. And you kind of know this, right? Everybody knows this because, first of all, if you're not living up to your responsibilities, even to take care of yourself, the probability that you're going to be ashamed of that at some level is extraordinarily high. And so your own soul tells you that you're in error, so to speak. But also, if you look at who you spontaneously admire, which is a good indication of where your value system really sits, you'll see that the people you admire are always people who take responsibility for themselves and responsibility for their family and responsibility for their community. You know, we're cynically, it's often considered that we admire, let's say, the rich and successful because of their status and their wealth and their power. But that's a very shallow and it's very trivial, and I also don't really believe that it's true. I think that the people we admire are people who conduct themselves admirably in life, and you get a spontaneous admiration as a consequence of that, and that's a call from the deepest reaches of your being to imitate and to follow in that pathway, and you can do that. So there are constraints on how you can interact with the world in a successful manner. Let's assume that you don't want undue pain and anxiety. We could just start with that, and I think that's a reasonable proposition. You can tolerate some pain and anxiety if it's in the service of something greater, obviously, but I just mean pointless pain and anxiety. We don't want any more of that than is necessary. And that means that you have to take care of yourself to some degree. But the manner in which you take care of yourself is severely constrained. This is partly why you have to be intelligent and careful and plot your way through life properly. You have to take care of yourself today, but you have to take care of yourself today in a way that doesn't interfere with you taking care of yourself tomorrow and next week and next month and next year and 5 years from now and 10 years from now. So you can't do just what you want to in the next hour, because if it's impulsive pleasure seeking, let's say, something like that, excess alcohol use or excess drug use or careless sexual behavior or betrayal of people to gain you something in the moment, you're going to pay for that. You're going to pay for it tomorrow. You're going to pay for it next week and next month and next year. So because you're going to exist in the future and because you have to live with yourself, there's only a certain number of ways that you can act that are going to work. But it's more than that. It's not just that you're responsible to your future self or the set of all your future selves, is that you also have to act in a way that works for your family, because otherwise your family is going to disintegrate and break down and cause you and them all sorts of misery and grief. And not just your family now, but also your family into the future. And then not just your family either, but also your community. And so you have to set your aspirations so that they serve you in the broadest sense over a long period of time, and they also serve your family and they also serve your community, and that's a very tight set of constraints. And I think that the best solution to that set of constraints from a philosophical perspective, or maybe even a theological perspective, is to view the world as a place not of groups but of individuals, of sovereign individuals who are responsible for their destinies, responsible for their families and for their communities. And that's essentially the ethos of the modern West, because the thing that's so remarkable about the West, I would say, is that we did a wonderful job of articulating out the idea of individual sovereignty, and we made that the cornerstone of our political and economic systems. And the thing about that is, it works. And the evidence that it works is, well, it's right here in this room. Everything in this room is working, right? And around the world, increasingly, people are becoming economically better off at a rate that's absolutely staggering. And a huge portion of that is because we've articulated out the ethos of the responsible sovereign individual. And that's not the same as the individual with rights. It's not like rights are irrelevant, but rights are really there to facilitate your adoption of individual responsibility. One of the things I would like to say to all of you, and it's one of the things I really wanted to talk about coming here today when I was thinking about it, is that you don't want to play identity politics. And that can happen because it can be played on the right and the left, right? And that's a collectivist idea. You don't want to do that. What you could bring to the table that hasn't been brought to the table for years is an emphasis on individual responsibility. And the right way to do that, as far as I'm concerned, is to start with yourselves, is develop a vision for your life. You start to think about, if you could be who you could be, what would that look like? That's the beginning of a mature philosophy of being. If you could be the person that you would admire, who would that person be? How would you configure yourself? How would you configure your career, your education, your family, the use of time outside of work? If you wanted to be the noblest person that you could be, who was adopting the maximal amount of responsibility, how would that look? Then you need a strategy to put that into place. And that's the way you change things properly, and also the way you do the least amount of harm while you're changing them. You need a meaning to offset the tragedy of life. Otherwise, you just suffer stupidly, and you tend to make people around you suffer the same way. It's
like,
not good.
It's what the modern left does
Yes,
quite well.
and the way that you find that meaning is by adopting as much responsibility as you can. And what's also so fascinating about that is, you know, you're characterized by an indefinite potential. And it isn't easy to understand exactly what that is, that potential, but you know, it's what people call you on when they say, you know, you're not living up to your potential, whatever that is. That potential will be called forth from you as a consequence of adoption of responsibility, because it won't manifest itself unless you take on a load. You're not going to develop in all the ways you could develop unless you set yourself a serious challenge, because it takes the challenge to pull that out of you, and also to motivate you to rid yourself of all the weaknesses and personality flaws that you've accumulated across the years, and to let those disappear and burn off you. You need to load yourself up before the demands of life will be such that you will discipline yourself properly. And a noble goal is a very good way of beginning that. Get your act together. You've got things to do in the world. The absence of your full being in the world leaves a hole that is filled by terrible things. At minimum, you have an ethical responsibility to ensure that the world doesn't devolve into something approximating hell. And at maximum, you have the responsibility, again, the ethical, and it's a heavy ethical responsibility, to do everything that's in your power to make things as good as you can possibly make them, in this sophisticated manner that takes you and your family and your community into account. And it's on you, right? And that's meaning. You know, people say, well, I'd like to have a meaningful life. It's like, well, fair enough, but the price that you pay for the meaning that transcends tragedy is the adoption of responsibility for the catastrophe of existence. But that ennobles you, right? It makes you into someone strong and someone competent and someone who's worthwhile and who lives in a manner that justifies their own suffering. And that's what, there's nothing better than you could possibly do than that.
So I just had a long discussion with Jocko Willink, and Jocko states very forthrightly in that interview, that discussion, that ever since he was 3 years old, he wanted to be a soldier, and he disavows any higher order moral virtue to that desire. He wanted to go out and be a soldier, to do what soldiers do. It was intrinsic. It was an intrinsic part of his personality. And make no mistake about it, I mean, we've been warriors forever, and some people are born like that, and he's definitely one of them. But he's highly socialized. We get less aggressive as we age, human beings. The most violent creatures are 2-year-olds. Punch, kick, hit, bite, steal. That's the definition. Physical violence. Okay. 2-year-olds, if you group people together in age similar groupings, the 2-year-olds have the most violent altercations. But then if you look at the 2-year-olds, it's a minority of the 2-year-olds who are violent. They're almost all male, and it's a small minority of the males. Okay, most of those males are socialized out of that antisocial aggression by the time they're 4. Those that aren't are permanently antisocial, although that declines after the age of about 27. So let's take that minority of aggressive kids. So, well, what does it mean to be aggressive? And this pertains to psychopathy. Psychopathy isn't a unitary dimension. It's not a personality attribute. It's a combination of traits. And so a real psychopath is low in agreeableness,
So low in compassion, low in politeness. That's the best personality predictor of criminal behavior. It's not very good, but it's the best one. And they're low in conscientiousness. Okay, so they have a parasitic lifestyle, that's low in conscientiousness, and they have no empathy. That's bad news. And then you can decorate the psychopathy. You could add low neuroticism to that, so there's no fear. You could add assertiveness from the extroversion dimension. So like your ultimate psychopath might be charming and assertive, right? Low in fear, low in agreeableness, low in conscientiousness. So they don't care about you. They'll exploit you for the future. They don't forego gratification, but they're charming. Then you can decompose that and you can say, well, those constituent elements of those traits are often extremely useful. Now, Jocko and his crew, the Navy SEAL types, they're deadly when you put them out against an enemy, but they're unbelievably socialized. Like Jocko stated very straightforwardly and makes a very credible case that the Navy SEALs their fundamental motivation isn't status for themselves, it's to protect the other people in the group. They're incredibly group affiliated, and I think you see that in any functional group of competitive men, is they compete for the position, but they have each other's backs. And if they don't, what you do with a guy like that, who you can't trust in the clinch, is you isolate him. Even if he's competent, if he won't subserve that competence to the group, you don't trust him, because in order to be in a position of authority for any length of time, you have to play an iterable game. It has to be able to repeat. And unless you engage in reciprocal behaviors with others, you can't dominate a social group for very long, because it'll rebel. So there's real constraints on the exercise of power in any functional hierarchy. And you even see that among chimps. Frans de Waal has documented this extremely well. The tyrant chimp can prevail momentarily, but the probability that he's going to get taken out is extremely high. And it's actually the pro-social chimp who's strong and fearless, let's say, that's much more likely to have a stable reign, let's say. So you can even see that in chimps. So I'm leery of the, CEOs equal psychopath argument. It's like, well, yeah, they're competitive, but they're conscientious. So that ameliorates the psychopathy, right? Like a disagreeable, conscientious person is really useful to have around, because they will tell you exactly what they think, because they don't care if they hurt your feelings. And that's kind of harsh. They will tell you, man, you'll know. But if they're conscientious, you can trust them.
One of the things that happens very often in psychotherapy, people come to psychotherapy for multiple reasons, but one of them is they often come because they're too agreeable. And so what they get is so-called assertiveness training, although it's not exactly assertiveness that's being trained. What it is the ability to learn how to negotiate on your own behalf. And one of the things I tell agreeable people, especially if they're conscientious, is say what you think. Tell the truth about what you think. There's going to be things you think that you think are nasty and harsh, and they probably are nasty and harsh, but they're also probably true. And you need to bring those up to the forefront and deliver the message. And it's not straightforward at all, because agreeable people do not like conflict. Not at all. They smooth the water. And you can see why that is in accordance with the hypothesis that I've been putting forward. You don't want conflict around infants. It's too damn dangerous. You don't want fights to break out. You don't want anything to disturb the relative peace. And if you're also more prone to being hurt physically and perhaps emotionally, you also may be loath to engage in the kind of high-intensity conflict that will solve problems in the short term, because it takes a lot of conflict to solve problems in the short term. And if that can spiral up to where it's dangerous, which it can if it gets uncontrolled, it might be safer in the short term to keep the waters smooth and to not delve into those situations where conflict emerges. The problem with that is it's not a very good medium to long-term strategy, right? Because lots of times there are things you have to talk about, because they're not going to go away. And so partly what you do with agreeable people is you get them to figure out, and they have a hard time with this too. If you ask a disagreeable person what he wants, say, or she wants, they'll tell you right away. They know. It's like, this is what I want, and this is how I'm going to get it. But agreeable people, especially if they're really agreeable, are so agreeable that they often don't even know what they want, because they're so accustomed to living for other people and to finding out what other people want and to trying to make them comfortable and so forth, that it's harder for them to find a sense of their own desires as they move through life. And that's not, look, there's situations where that's advantageous, but it's certainly not advantageous if you're going to try to forge yourself a career. That just doesn't work at all. And this is part of the reason that I'm an admirer of Carl Jung, because Jung makes it very clear that, see, he was very interested in the barriers to enlightenment. Because if there's such a thing as being enlightened, let's say, then why isn't everyone enlightened? If it's just a matter of taking the glorious route and following your bliss, let's say, it's like, well, that sounds pretty easy. Why isn't everyone enlightened? But Jung's thinking isn't like that at all. You know, he believed that in order to transform your personality, that first of all you had to be disciplined, that's for sure, but you also had to integrate that part of you that was terrible and capable of breaking rules and make it part of you. And so then, and I really like that idea. Well, here's an example. So about 20 years ago, I would say, there was a newspaper headline in one of Canada's major newspapers, and it was the Minister of Foreign Affairs at that time, Lloyd Axworthy, and he was talking about what had happened with Milosevic in the former Soviet Union in Yugoslavia and the atrocities that were being committed. And he said that he was caught unawares by that because he didn't have the imagination for that kind of evil. And I thought, well, you know, you think that what you're doing is signaling your virtue by making a statement like that. But from my perspective, all you're doing is stating your cowardice and your historical ignorance, because if you're going to be Minister of Foreign Affairs, you bloody well better have imagination for that kind of evil. Because if you don't, then anyone who does wins. They beat you. And so you know, again, in the Harry Potter stories, you see he's touched by evil, right? He actually has a soul fragment that's embedded within him that's as black as anything can possibly be. That's why he can talk to snakes. But without that, he wouldn't be able to have any victory. And that's exactly right psychologically. Unless you can think the way that an evil person thinks, then you're defenseless against them, because they'll go places you can't imagine, and then they win. And so the best men I've met, it was interesting even when I was in junior high and high school, because most of my friends dropped out, you know, by the time they were grade 10, thereabouts. And a lot of them were guys who developed physically. They're pretty powerful, and they're just damn sick of putting up their hand to go to the bathroom. It's like, you know, they're not doing that anymore. One of my friends got kicked out when he sort of challenged the gym teacher, you know, physically. And the gym teacher, he could do an iron cross. He was a tough guy, and so it was no trivial matter for my friend to stand up to him, but he got expelled anyways. But, you know, I noticed that it was often the kids whose character I admired that either quit or got expelled, and they were the tougher guys who were just sick and tired of following rules that didn't take into account their character, and then they'd go off and work in the oil rigs or whatever. And you could do that in Alberta at that time, and that was really hard work, you know. So it wasn't like they were necessarily taking the easy path. But like, a harmless man is not a good man. A good man is a very, very dangerous man who has that under voluntary control. And you know, you also see that like one of the central female stories, let's say, if the hero archetype is the central male story, there are variants of hero archetypes that are relevant to women, and one of them is Beauty and the Beast. And you know, Beauty isn't interested in the guy who isn't the beast. She's interested in the guy who's the beast, and that's exactly right. But she's interested in the guy who's the beast that can be civilized and disciplined, right, and who can use that in the service, well, let's say, of a family. Look, a great hunter, let's say, might become a leader in a hunter-gatherer group. But part of what makes him a great hunter is the fact that he shares. I mean, he hunts, but he has to share. And that's also to his benefit, because then if someone else hunts and is successful, he gets his share. But so there's the aggression that goes along with hunting, and the dominance that goes along with maybe the seeking of status in that particular domain. But no complex human hierarchy is sustainable without reciprocity. And that's why the Marxist criticisms of hierarchy as only based in power, they're just wrong. It's just not the case. When a hierarchy degenerates, then it becomes based on power. Any hierarchy, it could be a creative hierarchy, it could be a competency hierarchy. If it's power, then it's degenerated. It's become the evil tyrant, and then it's time for a revolution. And so, you know, the revolutionary Marxist types can take that fundamental truth
which is that sometimes it's time for a revolution, and that's when power dominates. And they can use that as a motivator because it speaks to us very deeply. But it's very dangerous to apply that to situations where what's producing hierarchical position is multifactorial. And no one in their right mind, if they think about it, as far as I'm concerned, can say that the functional hierarchies that characterize most social organizations in the West, they're just not based on power. That's just wrong. Plumbers, competency. Lawyers, competency. Might be dominance and assertiveness and even a lack of empathy among prosecutors, for example. You know, you have to have a killer instinct. But it's competence. It's ability to do the job. Rule 3 in Beyond Order, do not hide things in the fog. It's like realization is generally an effortful process. Like you're alerted to your own wrongdoing by glimmerings of conscience, let's say, feelings of shame and doubt. But you have to unpack those to find out exactly what you're doing wrong. And that's really hard. It's effortful. And so you can just not do it. And the way you don't do it is you take refuge in your blind conformity. And that's part of that pluralistic ignorance. And I suppose that's one of the flaws of the argument that you laid out. It's like, yeah, people were pluralistically ignorant, but how much of that was turning a blind eye? And you can maintain a very high level of plausible ignorance by turning a blind eye. And you know, in the ancient Egyptian story that I'm so enamored with, the story of Osiris and his degeneration. So he's the god of the state. Osiris degenerates because he turns a blind eye to the machinations of his evil brother. He could know, but he decides not to. And that's a moral sin in my estimation. And so out of the story that you told with regards to pluralistic ignorance, I would add a psychological component is, yeah, well, how much could have people known if they would have allowed themselves to investigate instead of refusing it? So, you know, with Freud, you have the idea of repression. You know something uncomfortable and you suppress it, and it's there and you can rediscover it. But it's not exactly right, because what happens is that you have a hint that something's rotten in the state of Denmark, and that elicits an exploratory tendency and an avoidance tendency as well. And you can just leave it unpacked. And then the rot that you're detecting subliminally, let's say, accumulates around you. And if it accumulates enough, it turns into the dragon of chaos. It's like, and then you get the situation that you described. By the time that you can no longer turn a blind eye, the thing that you avoided is so monstrous that you cannot prevail against it. So I would still say, even if that entire explanatory story is correct, it misses the moral culpability element, which is, yeah, okay, just how much could have you known? You know, and I have some sympathy for this. Believe me, I understand why people are blind to the horrors of malevolence, let's say, because malevolence, when confronted, is traumatizing. And you see that in the post-traumatic stress disorder literature. It's contact with malevolence that traumatizes people. You know, the contact with someone who really, really wants to hurt them. And they're shocked by that can even exist. It's terrible, especially when you start looking into it. It undoes you, it unglues you, especially if you are a naive believer in the, you know, untrammeled goodness of human beings or even of existence. In any case, you know, you turn a blind eye, and ancient stories warn about this all the time. You turn a blind eye and then things go rotten under your sovereignty. And by the time you're awake, it's too late. And that isn't, you've abdicated your responsibility. And that happens bit by bit, right? That's the other thing about it that's so pernicious. It's like people ask me, for example, why I chose this bill in Canada to die as a hill to die on, let's say. And it's like, yeah. Well, you're going to say no. If you ever say no, you're going to say no to something trivial, because things that go astray bit by bit. And so there's virtually never a sliding point where everyone says, oh, no. It's like, well, this much more. Well, I'm uneasy. but I accept it. Well, then it's a little worse, and you're a little lesser. And then it's this much more, you know? And the probability that that will happen is there all the time. And it's as moral citizens that who have a moral obligation to see what's in front of us, that we hold that at bay always. It's with our eyes open. That's why Horus in the Egyptian story is the eye. He's not thinking. It's not thought. It's attention. See. It's the willingness to turn your eyes to the phenomena and see what's there. And the Egyptians regarded that as part of what was redemptive. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. You know, conscious attention as the source of eternal redemption. Right. And I spent a lot of time talking about this in Maps of Meaning. So your interest manifests itself in ways you can't control, right? The instinct of meaning manifests itself, and then you follow it. That's the spirit Mercurius, right? He's the winged messenger of the gods, and so something brightens up for you, and you follow that, and you find your destiny that way. Jung's notion was that was the manner in which your potential future self manifested itself in the present and pulled you along. And so an example of that would be, maybe you're a child and you find someone you admire, and so they sort of glow, and then you mimic them. And it's because the mechanisms in your mind that are propelling you towards maturation find someone who's like you, so they're in the zone of proximal development, but somewhat more advanced. You latch onto them as an idol, let's say, and you mimic them, and that catalyzes your development. So that's the manifestation of interest. Now imagine that you pathologize that by through deceit and self-deception and refusal to attend to what's right in front of you. Well, you make yourself weak because you don't develop well, but you also pathologize that mechanism. The question is, what do you doom yourself to if you remain banal? And I think you doom yourself to an unconscious fascination with unearned power. So in some sense, she had the causal story backwards.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah. So
we're not designed to be banal, right? Like we don't respect ourselves then. We're designed to, so to speak, like many of us are designed to bear a heavy burden, right? To be of service to our fellow man. We find meaning in that, deep meaning. And if we're not doing that, then our lives are not deep and meaningful, and then the suffering can easily make us corrupt.
Maybe it's too easy in a large society like ours to hide in the nooks and crannies and be banal without having to be on the front lines and pay the price. Well,
it's very dissatisfying to young people when that's the case. You know, their heart burns, but they have nowhere to go, and they can't tolerate that. Like Piaget, for example, pointed out that, although you never hear this when you study developmental psychology, you have to read Piaget. He pointed out that late adolescents reliably go through a messianic phase, right? They're compelled to change the world. They feel called out to this quasi-messianic destiny, and certainly ideologues are great at harnessing that, but that needs to be placed within what I would say is a proper traditional/religious context, and this is one of the great advantages I truly believe that Christianity has, perhaps not over other faiths. I'm not making that case, but certainly in contrast to ideologies. It's like, well, you harness that messianic spirit to organize and purify, so to speak, your own soul. You don't go over after an external enemy. And there's a heroic battle in that. That's the battle between the adversary and the hero, and that's within, not external. It's within. It's safer that way. Much safer. And then you have good citizens if that works out, because they get themselves in order, you know, and more than in order. They become masters of chaos as well as order. And that's also what I see as something that's so profound about the biblical narrative, because it insists upon this psychologization of utopia. It becomes a psychological drama, not a political drama. It's a psychological drama. The moral battle takes place within the confines of your own psyche. And I think people know that because they see that they're tortured by their own consciences. you know that because of our moral ambivalence, each of us, we're less committed to our task than we might be. We're plagued by existential doubts. We're held back by our resentment and our bitterness. We get in our own way. We have an ambivalent sense of whether we're worthy, as individuals or as a species for that matter. And so we stumble forward half crippled, and maybe we move towards the light regardless, but we're not all in by any stretch of the imagination as individuals or as a culture or as any culture. So then you ask yourself, well, what would you be like if you were all in? And then what would a culture be like if it was composed of people who were nothing but all in? If we devoted everything we had to the task at hand, to the highest good, and we moved away from our adversarial identification and our nihilism and our desire for destruction and our willingness to wallow in misery and to perpetuate it. Well, what would we do? Would we defeat death? Would we bring about immortal life? Would we resurrect the dead? Who knows what we could do? I don't see that human possibility is bounded in any realistic sense. What we've already accomplished is absolutely beyond comprehension. And there are many things that we don't understand at all. And many of those things are going to be revolutionary. They're going to change the way we look at everything. Yeah, well, we're not animals in a zoo. Like we're not camels in a zoo. We're not herbivores, and just because we have enough straw doesn't mean we're going to lose our unbelievable capacity for destructive creation. And we don't know how to harness that. And I've been trying, I suppose, in some sense to meet that desire for a call to adventure with what I'm writing and with my lectures and to use responsibility in this moral domain as a battle that's of sufficient intensity to engage young people in particular property. It's like, get yourself together, see how difficult that is, see what you can do, put yourself together, stop doing the things you know to be wrong, and see what happens. Put yourself together. And there's been an unbelievable response to that. And I think it's harmless in some sense, or as harmless as such things can be, because it is focused. It's like, change you. Leave the other people alone. Or if you want to change them, maybe you can do it through example. But they're not the problem. You have enough problems with yourself. It's like, well, what are you complaining about? You've got enough to eat. It's like, fair enough, who wants to starve, right? And so it's even hard to fight against. Well, I should be grateful for that. And yes, you should, but it's not enough. And you think about where we came from, our ancestors, what they struggled against, and from the time we were, from our animal forebears all the way up to where we are now. Whatever we're made for, it's not Twinkies and TV. It's not willful blindness and the comfort that brings. It's not enough. And so we need this adventure. And that's something we're going to all have to contend with, because if we don't get the adventure right, then we'll get it wrong, and it'll lead us in terrible places. One of the things I've said that people have repeated many times, and that it's in memes and you can buy it on, merchandise items and that sort of thing. A good man is a very dangerous man who has himself under control. And no one ever says that. So you say to young men, look, like, your job is to be as dangerous as you possibly can be in every possible direction, and to control that, right? Not to be harmless and slothful and contemptible even in your own eyes. And that way you get the power of the shadow. You don't have to dispense with the anger and the aggression. You can integrate it. And that's way better. I mean, I had a remarkable conversation with Jocko Willink. I felt it was remarkable. It was very engrossing. And Willink, he's unlike me in many ways. I mean, he's a physical specimen of sort of unparalleled proportions to begin with. He's about 2 feet thick, you know, and he's this military guy, highly disciplined and also extraordinarily morally integrated. And he's an admirable person because the danger is right there under the surface. But he has it rather than it having him. And we're uncomfortable with the idea that that's the proper route for socialization. We try to teach our children that only, cooperative games are acceptable. And they know in their hearts that that's a complete bloody lie. It's not technically sustainable. It's not even conceptually correct. I'm not saying I've solved it. I talk to Bjorn about this a lot. It's like, I love your message. Wouldn't it be wonderful to eradicate absolute poverty? And he does this great job technically of rank ordering global concerns, doing a cost benefit analysis that's methodologically rigorous and saying, look, we can devote money here. We'll get a 20-to-1 return. It's mostly in child nutrition, as it turns out. Couldn't we do an immense amount of good with targeted spending? And the answer is clearly yes. We could eradicate child poverty in the next 15 years. We probably will. We could do great things, but we don't know how to sell it. And that's a huge problem. I've never had more of a response from a crowd than when I draw a relationship between responsibility and meaning. Without fail, that brings the crowd to silence. And it's because that connection hasn't been made explicit sufficiently, I would say, is that we find meaning in responsibility. And there is a messianic call that's embedded in this. And you can translate that into get yourself together, see what you could become. And, much of Beyond Order is exactly that. It's push your limits, move beyond yourself, discipline yourself, but move beyond that discipline. Don't let that order constrain who you could be because it's not a high enough order yet. And I would say it looks like that is attractive to young people and perhaps specifically to young men, but not only to young men and not only to the young. So, well, that's a problem that we have to address is, we are doing a lot of things right, but it's not romantic enough. The clinical experience and my lecturing experience has been unbelievably positive in the main. And the clinical experience was positive because I was always on the side of the part of the person that was oriented towards their own health and improvement. That was part of our contractual pact. I'd often make that explicit. It's like, I'm not here for unconditional positive regard. I'm on the side of the part of you that wants everything to be better. And we're going to discover where that is and we're going to work to facilitate it. And people loved that. And it was so gratifying to engage in that work. It was constantly positive. I worked with a huge variety of people, from people who had nothing, no gifts, and were just off the edges of the world, to people who were unbelievably talented and gifted, the whole gamut. And that was absolutely wonderful to see that range of people. And the lecturing has been the same way. Like the lecture tour I did was immensely positive, too much positive even. You wouldn't think that would be possible, but it is possible. And I'm very positively oriented towards human beings in the main, despite I think we're great. Flawed and terribly, but no wonder. No wonder. I mean, the burden we bear is absolutely, it's absurd. The existentialists made much of that. We have an absurd existence. We're aware of our own mortality. God, and we're animals. We're aware of our own mortality. What a burden. And yet here we are. And much of the time we're not corrupt and horrible. It's a miracle. So, it's a word of encouragement, and that's what people are responding so positively to in a time where everyone is told this story that, human activity is all a struggle for power and that we're fundamentally a destructive force and that we should rein ourselves in. And I'm not selling that message. It's a word of encouragement. You could be more than you are, and wouldn't that be great for everyone, including you? In my writings and my lectures, I've tried to encourage people to deal with malevolence at the level of the individual. Because when you start dealing with it in others, you
there's a big risk in that. It's like clean up your own house, which is
Right.
I mean,
right.
I've been parodied for that. So, well, look at all the social problems in the world, and Dr. Peterson is telling the oppressed to clean up their rooms. It's like, how is that going to solve anything? It's, well, first of all, have you tried it? Actually, it's not that bloody easy to clean up your room.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so
It's harder.
and-
It's much easier to clean somebody else's room.
yes, or it's certainly a lot easier to point to the mess in someone else's room.
Yes.
And you know, there's
Yes.
such a danger. There's such a danger in that, and it's so attractive, right, to identify, to localize malevolence externally. It's so attractive because, first of all, it lets you off the hook, and that's a relief. And second, if you've identified malevolence, there's nothing you can do to what is malevolent that's unjustifiable. And so your worst impulses have free reign. Because especially
become
if you
that
can
which you
also add to that
despise.
a good cause. You know, you say, well, this is in the service of the eventual utopia. It's like, well, now you have carte blanche for your worst motivations. And that's very, very dangerous. And so I always think that it's better to stick to the psychological.
How do you get people to recognize and then have the courage to stand? You've taken a beating. Nobody wants to do that. Why is that worth it, and how do you get there?
Well, I think it's worth it because I believe the alternative is worse. I mean, that's why I think it's worth it. I think it's
What's
a
the
decision that you
alternative?
make to stay silent when you have something to say. You know, you don't know what it is within you that requires your voice, right? Because you feel, I have something to say. It's like, well, where does that come from exactly, that feeling that you have something to say? You're disgruntled at work and you're choking on your own bile because the situation is not just in your estimation. You're dying to say something, but you won't. Well, you'll die if you don't say it. Maybe it's a death of 1,000 cuts. I don't like deferred punishment. I'd rather take it now and keep the future clean. Which is why I encourage people to have the fights now. Not to hide things in the fog for later, because they grow and metastasize. It's better to confront what you need to confront when it's small and when you have some possibility of victory. One of the things that I puzzled out a long while back and tried to adhere to the best of my ability was driven by exactly the concern that you're expressing. Because I realized that the instinct for meaning is a genuine instinct, and it underlies even our attention. It's unbelievably deep. It's the deepest thing about us. Okay, but what about
The
people
search for meaning? That's that, or
the
meaning
experience
itself?
and the search.
Okay.
Well, I would say both of those. Both of those
Okay.
they're somewhat independent, because the search for meaning is very motivating, but the experience of meaning is something in and of itself. We talked about that in
Yes.
relationship to the night sky, for example.
Right.
So, okay, but your objection was, well, what if that meaning instinct goes wrong? It's like, yeah, what if? What if? Okay, how do you make it go wrong? Lie and see what happens. Because you'll pathologize that instinct and then you're lost. So if you understand that, there isn't anything more frightening than understanding that. Because your stability as an entity, as a soul, is dependent on your relationship with that instinct for meaning. And if you pathologize that with deceit, you will find yourself in the hands of things that you do not want to be in the hands of. Put it that way.
But
So if you're
the argument today is there is no truth. Whose truth? It's my truth. It's your truth. I think what you're saying is you find meaning in truth, and if you're lying about something, then that's the absence of truth. But
well, if you
where
tell
is-
the truth, to the best of your ability, then you can trust your instincts to some degree, to the greatest degree that you're capable of, and then that can help orient you in the world properly. You can rely on your instincts if you don't pathologize the information that you're feeding yourself. So, if you want to live in harmony with yourself, which you would assume to be somewhat desirable rather than
Right.
a hellish disharmony, then don't feed yourself what's indigestible.
And certainly don't warp the world around you with deceit you know to be deceitful. It's extraordinarily damaging and dangerous. Well, because I realized that the instinct for meaning could become pathologized. That's what made me obsessed to begin with about the spoken word, with free speech, for example. You were also talking about what orients us in the middle. Well, the thing about the middle is where the middle is shifts because the environment around us shifts, the natural world shifts, the social world shifts, and so that middle moves on us. And so what we do is we talk to each other, which is a form of thinking. Thinking is internalized speech. So the dialogue we're having is thought. If I'm thinking, I just have that dialogue in my head by myself. It's still a dialogue between two viewpoints. So we orient ourselves with untrammeled, honest speech in a constant search to find that optimal middle ground. But it always moves. So we are destined in some sense to continually communicate about where we should be. That's for sure. But the idea that there's a desirable middle that we can attain through dialogue, well, that's a presupposition of Western individualism. So if you buy the idea that our institutions are basically predicated on tyrannical power, so that's the basis for institutional organization is power. Then you buy the argument that the dialogue between institutions is nothing but the expression of that power. There are no individuals and there's no space for rational negotiation. And that case is being made constantly, particularly by radicals on the left. It is fundamentally anti-individual. And there is no room in that system for free speech itself. It's not like it's anti-free speech. That's a misconception. Something isn't anti-free speech if it has no room whatsoever for the concept of free speech. That's a much deeper criticism, and that's part of what's driving this identity politics movement. It's an assault on the idea of the individual word, the word itself. It's an assault on the idea of the redemptive power of the word itself. There's no individuals, there's no rational discourse, there's no possibility of meeting in the middle. There's no middle. There's just a territory defined by struggles for power between groups. That's why it's okay not to invite someone who disagrees with you. They don't disagree with you. They represent a different power structure. And you might think you have an opinion, but you don't. You're merely mouthing the platitudes of your social structure. You're not there as an individual, not from that perspective. This is a much more radical critique than people generally realize. It goes all the way to the bottom. Write it out. Yep, write it out, write it out. Everything you can remember about it. We have software online at a site called selfauthoring.com that helps people write an autobiography. And so they go through their lives, breaking their lives into epochs and identifying the most emotionally and practically significant events and detailing them. And that's all in an attempt to help people forget and to let go of uncertainty and threat and anxiety and, well, the whole panoply of negative emotions that their life memories might otherwise be contaminated with. And so you do that in therapy continually with people when you're talking about their past. And it isn't catharsis. The Freudians believed, for example, that if someone had a traumatic experience and then they were able to express the emotion that was associated with that experience, that would be curative. But it doesn't look like it's the expression of the emotion. It looks like it's the extraction of the significance of the event.